Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy. It was late January when I headed up to the old family cabin to check my winter trap lines. The cabin sat at the edge of a long-dead logging road, a place tucked so deep in the woods that even the snowmobiles had a hard time reaching it. My dad and grandfather used it for decades, but these days I was the only one left running the line. I planned to stay 4 or 5 days, enough to make the rounds and reset anything that needed it. The snow was deep and fresh. Nobody had been back there since the last storm. I parked where the old road turned too narrow to drive and strapped on my snowshoes, hauling my sled of supplies through thick pine stands and across frozen creeks until the roof of the cabin came into view, sagging a little under the snow but still holding strong. I unlocked the front door, stepped in, and shut it behind me. Then I bolted it like I always do and wedged the old board across the inner frame for good measure. A habit more than anything. There wasn't a soul for miles, and with snow this deep, if anyone had followed me and I'd have seen their tracks. But still, the cabin had always felt better sealed up tight. Inside, it smelled like dry pine and old firewood. Dust clung to the windows, and the air had a biting cold to it. I unpacked quick, got the stove going with kindling, and started bringing in logs from the woodpile just outside. The snow was falling again by evening, light and steady, the kind that adds up over hours. I spent that first night eating beans straight from the pot and going over my maps. When I turned in, I made sure the stove was banked, the lantern lit low on the table, and both the front and back doors were secure. The back door especially, I nailed that one shut from the inside years ago. It opened out onto a rocky ledge that dropped steeply into the woods. It hadn't been used in at least a decade. The next morning was cold and clear. I had breakfast, layered up, and spent the day checking the southern traps. Pulled in 3 pine marten and a half-frozen fisher, reset some snares, and made it back just before dark. I kicked off the snow from my boots, locked the door behind me, and shook off the chill. That night passed quiet. The stove glowed and crackled, and I let myself get comfortable, reading an old book by lantern light. It was the second morning I noticed something. My pack wasn't where I left it. I always drop it beside the stove to let any snow or ice melt off into the tin tray below. But it was off to the side, closer to the cot. I stared at it for a while, tried to remember if I'd moved it and forgot. Maybe I had. I shrugged it off and got on with the day. More traps that afternoon. Snow heavier now, harder to push through. I checked the upper ridges, nothing caught, just tracks winding in and out of the trees. I returned late, soaked with sweat and aching. Again, I locked the front door, checked the windows, and added a couple logs to the indoor stack. As I peeled off my boots, I noticed something strange. The laces were undone. I tied them tight, double knotted. I had to. Stumbling around in snowshoes with loose boots was a good way to break your ankle. I tried to think back, if I'd maybe loosened them without noticing. But no, I remember sitting down, unhooking my snowshoes, then kicking off the boots. They weren't untied when I did that. Now, they were. It sat in the back of my mind all night. The way the pack had been moved. The laces. Nothing big, but enough to itch in my brain while I tried to sleep. I told myself I was tired, maybe just not paying attention like I usually do. It had been a long day. Too long. Maybe I was just getting sloppy. That night, I made a point of going through everything carefully. I checked every latch, every nail. Nothing was disturbed. The back door was still shut and nailed tight. The windows were fogged from the inside and frozen from the out. No cracks, no breezes. I even opened the trapdoor to the root cellar to make sure nothing was hiding down there, but all I saw was old King Goods, a coil of rope, and a rusted shovel. I closed it, locked it, and shoved a stool over it just in case. I lit the lantern again, set it beside the bed, and banked the fire down low. I kept my boots beside me this time. I even laid the pack on the cot, so I'd hear it if it shifted. And then the third night came. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. I remember the dark. That thick, heavy, kind of dark you get out in the woods with no moon and cloud cover. No light from the lantern. No glow from the stove. It was just black. I could hear the wind outside, a soft moan through the trees, snow tapping gently against the windows. And I remember lying there, feeling strange. The kind of strange that makes you stop breathing for a second. Something was wrong. I sat up, disoriented. The air was cold, too cold. The fire must have gone out. I reached for the lantern. My hand met nothing but the table's edge. I fumbled around, trying to find the box of matches, the base of the lamp, anything. And then I heard it, breathing. Not mine. I was holding mine. This was slow, steady and close. Inches from my face. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the sound. A warmth, a presence, something real. I froze. I didn't move a muscle. I listened. In, out, in, out. I shot my arm out and swept across the table, found the lantern by feel, grabbed it, and lit the match with shaking hands. The flame caught on the third strike, and the small glass globe glowed orange. No one was there. Nothing beside the cot. No figure. No person. Nothing I could see. But my breath was steaming, and the back of my neck prickled like I'd just been watched. Then I turned. The back door was wide open. Nails pulled straight through the frame. Jagged splinters where the hinges had been. Snow was blowing it across the floor. A long trail of it, all the way to the cot. No footprints, just wind-driven snow. But I knew it hadn't been open when I went to bed. I knew it had been shut for years, sealed from inside, the boards hammered flat. I stood there shaking, holding the lantern like it could protect me. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I kept the light on and sat in the chair by the stove, staring at the door. I thought about leaving right then, but I didn't want to walk out into that, into whatever had just walked out. When the sun finally started to rise, I packed my gear in silence. I didn't touch the back door. I left it open. I didn't fix the hinges or pick up the nails. I left them scattered on the floor. I locked the front door, snowshoes strapped on, and walked out without eating, without coffee, without a look back. Just walked. I didn't talk about it for weeks, maybe months. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the wind pushed the door open somehow, that the breathing was a dream. I told myself all kinds of things. But in spring, when the ice melted off the trails and the roads started to open, I went back. I needed to, just to see, just to prove to myself there was a logical explanation. The cabin stood just as I left it. The front door was shut but unbolted. The back door was still hanging open, the wind having stripped the snow clean away. The frame was twisted from the nails. I stepped inside. The air was stale, still cold, dust in the light. I checked everything again, slowly, carefully, and then I saw the marks. On the inside of the front door, deep gouges in the wood. Parallel, claw-like, not animal claws, human fingers. Scratches in sets of 4, sometimes 5, dragged across the surface as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. Near the handle, near the bottom, even up high where no one should have reached without a chair. I leaned in close. Some of the scratches had small fragments still lodged in the wood. Curled slivers of nail. Fingernail. Human. I stepped back, heart pounding. Whatever had been in there with me wasn't trying to get in. It had been inside the whole time. Maybe hiding in the crawl space. Maybe in the root cellar tucked behind old shelves. I don't know, but I know it was in there. Watching me. Breathing next to me. Moving my things. I haven't been back since. Haven't run the winter lines. I pull traps only during the shoulder seasons now. Cabin's still standing, far as I know, but I don't talk about it much. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. And the ones who would, they wouldn't sleep easy either. I've been planning the trip for a while. I wanted to get far off the beaten path, away from shelters, away from other hikers, away from the noise of towns and trailheads and any cell signal. It had been a rough few months. I needed to clear my head, just me and my pack in the woods. I'd picked a section of forest I knew didn't get a lot of foot traffic, deep backcountry, miles from any established sites. I had enough food for 5 days and my GPS tracker. I'd left my itinerary with a friend back home, told her not to worry unless she didn't hear from me after 5 days. The first 2 days were uneventful. The terrain was steep and a little overgrown in spots, which meant fewer hikers came through. That was exactly what I wanted. I passed no one. I didn't even see any old boot prints on the trail. Every night, I picked a flat piece of ground far from any obvious trail, hung my bear bag, and fell asleep to the sounds of wind through the trees and the occasional far-off rustle of something in the underbrush. Nothing out of the ordinary. On the third day, I made camp earlier than usual. I'd started to feel a little off, slightly nauseous, maybe from a water refill that hadn't fully purified or just from exertion and heat. I'd set up by a creek, filtered more water carefully, ate a dry granola bar, and curled up my sleeping bag around sundown. It was the kind of quiet you only find way out there. No engines, no dogs barking in the distance, not even planes overhead. Just the slow trickle of the creek and the whisper of wind in the branches. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. I knew it was late because the fire was out and my watch, which glowed slightly when I tapped it, said 12:17 a.m. I hadn't needed to pee, I wasn't cold, and there was no loud noise that had jolted me awake. Just a strange, crawling feeling in my gut, like something was wrong. Then I heard it, a baby crying, not far off, not echoing through the trees like from a distant campsite or across a ravine. It was close, right outside my tent. My brain struggled to make sense of it. I just laid there in my sleeping bag, my heart suddenly hammering so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The crying wasn't panicked or hysterical. It was steady, rhythmic. A bit too steady, actually. The first thing that hit me was confusion. There were no families out here. None. I hadn't seen a single hiker since I'd stepped onto the trail. There were no reports of missing people. I knew this because I'd checked the trailhead bulletin and the ranger site before I left. There was no way in hell someone would bring a baby out here. The second thing that hit me was the cold wave of fear. I stayed completely still. My sleeping bag suddenly felt like a trap. Every part of me wanted to unzip it and scramble for my knife. But I waited. I kept listening. The crying continued for maybe another 10 seconds, then stopped. Silence. I stared at the roof of my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The silence dragged on so long, I started to think I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe it was some kind of animal that sounded like a baby. Then the crying started again. But this time it was different. It sounded flat, like the tone didn't change. No variation in pitch or volume. Not like a real baby. More like a recording. My blood went ice cold. I knew, in that instant, with total clarity, that someone was out there. Someone was trying to lure me out of my tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even reach for my flashlight. I laid there, still as stone, listening. The crying stopped again. For the next hour, I stayed like that. No sound. I heard a single branch snap at one point off to the side of the tent, but that was it. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. I waited, straining my ears. Every time a breeze moved through the trees, I flinched. Eventually, I worked one hand free and slid it toward the side pocket of the tent where my knife was. I gripped it hard, keeping the blade folded but ready. My hand stayed around it the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I didn't close my eyes. Every so often, I'd hear a twig crack or a faint rustle, but it was always too brief to be sure. Maybe an animal, maybe not. The worst part was the uncertainty. Not knowing who or what was out there. Not knowing if they were still watching me. Not knowing what would happen if I stepped outside. When the light finally started to shift through the trees, I still waited. I didn't move until the sun was fully up and the shadows had retreated. Only then did I slowly unzip the tent and crawl out, knife in hand. The air was still. The forest looked normal. Nothing out of place. But I didn't feel safe. I stood up and turned around to check the area, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints. Bare feet. They were small. Child-sized. No tread. No socks. Just human feet. Small and clean enough to make out the toes in the soft dirt. They circled my tent once, twice, maybe more. I couldn't tell how many loops. Some prints overlapped. They weren't deep, which meant whoever was had been light or very careful. But they were clear. Someone had been out there, in the dark, barefoot, walking around my tent over and over. I stared at them for a long time. The prints didn't lead away in a straight line. They just faded off into the underbrush, toward the slope I'd come down the day before. No sign of where they started. No sign of anything else. I didn't break down. I didn't scream. I just packed up. I didn't bother eating. I didn't refill water. I didn't even roll my sleeping bag the right way. I just crammed everything into my pack, shouldered it, and started hiking out. I took the same path back I'd come in, but I didn't stop. I didn't rest. Every 5 minutes, I turned around, checking the trail behind me. Every noise made me whip my head to the side. I didn't listen to music or put in earbuds like I usually did. I wanted to hear everything. By noon, I was dripping sweat. My legs were shaking. I was dehydrated, but I kept moving. Every time I thought about stopping, I pictured those footprints. I pictured that crying, that flat, fake sound just beyond my tent wall. I kept my knife in hand the whole way back. Even when my hand cramped from holding it too tight, I didn't put it away. I made it to the trailhead just before dusk. I was exhausted. My knees were shot. My back ached. I looked like I'd been through hell. But I didn't stop until I hit the gravel parking lot where my car was still parked undisturbed. When I finally locked the car doors and sat down inside, I felt everything hit me at once. The adrenaline wore off. I started shaking. My eyes welled up, and I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the trees. I didn't call anyone. I didn't report anything. What I have said, someone played a baby recording outside my tent in the middle of the woods and left bare footprints. No one would have believed me. I barely believed it myself. But it was real. I've done dozens of solo hikes, camped all over. I've seen bears. I've had close calls with injuries and weather and getting lost. But nothing ever got under my skin like this did. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a person. A real, breathing human being who hiked out into the woods, barefoot, carrying a recording of a baby crying just to mess with someone. Or maybe worse. I don't know what their goal was. Maybe they were hoping I'd unzip the tent and step outside. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. Or maybe they weren't alone. Whatever the reason, they knew I was there. They knew I was alone. And they wanted me to come out. Since then, I still hike. I still go solo sometimes. But I'm more careful. I research the area better. I keep my GPS beacon on at night, not just in my pack. I don't camp too far from the trail. And I never, ever ignore that gut feeling that something's off. Because that night, the only thing that saved me was staying put. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stepped outside. I don't want to know. All I know is that there are people out there who do things like that. Not because they're crazy, not because they're supernatural, but because they can, because deep in the woods, there are no rules. No cameras, no help, just you, alone, and whoever else might be watching. I don't know what I was looking for exactly. I just had the urge to go off the trail. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe boredom. We'd been hiking Palo Duro Canyon for a couple of days, camping in a more remote part of the park. Not completely out in the middle of nowhere. There were still other campers a few miles away, and the trail wasn't far, but far enough that you felt like you could vanish out there and no one would notice for days. I like that feeling. I've always liked pushing into places people don't normally go. That day, the sun was high, maybe 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and the wind was picking up like it does out there sometimes, all dry and sharp, cutting through your clothes no matter how hot it is. I left the trail just past a sharp bend, walking along a ridge that looked like it led to a small drop-off or ledge. I didn't tell my wife I was heading off. She was back at camp taking a nap. We'd already been hiking for most of the morning, and I still had a little left in me. So I figured I'd do some exploring and be back before she even noticed I was gone. I had my day pack, just a small one with some snacks, a water bottle, a flashlight, and a compact first aid kit. I didn't think I'd need any of it, honestly. I just wanted to stretch my legs and look around. The terrain out there is red clay and loose rock, with some scrub brush and little caves formed in the cliffs. It's all dry and dusty, with this brittle, ancient silence that settles on everything. The kind of place where your footsteps sound loud, even when you're trying to be quiet. The wind echoes in weird ways, bouncing off walls and into gullies so that you can't always tell where it's coming from. The day was blowing hard enough that you could feel the grit getting in your teeth, sticking to your sweat. I walked maybe 2-3 miles off trail. Nothing crazy, just a slow wander along what I thought was a solid route. I stayed up high, following the edge of a narrow ridge that gave me a view out across the canyon. Every now and then I'd spot one of those little cave mouths, most of them too shallow or too narrow to get into, just places where the rock had eroded over time. I kept going, probably farther than I should have, but I didn't feel tired. It was one of those days where everything feels still, where you think nothing can go wrong because nothing has yet. Then the ground gave out from under me. There was no warning. One step it felt solid, and the next I was falling. It wasn't a dramatic, tumbling fall like in the movies. It was more like the earth just opened up and took me in. The red clay crumbled beneath my feet, and I dropped straight down into this narrow chute. My boots scraped against the sides, loose rock and dust came with me, and I slid hard, maybe 10 or 12 feet in a matter of seconds. Just a steep, tight, dusty shaft that seemed to go deeper than it had any right to. I didn't even have time to yell. The chute was only a couple of feet wide, narrowing as it went down, and my pack, thank God, jammed up between the walls and stopped me. The bottom of the chute just vanished into black. I don't know how far it went. I don't want to know. If I hadn't been wearing that pack, I would have slid all the way down. It could have been 20 feet, 50, maybe more. The canyon's full of those weird formations, old erosion channels and hollowed out spaces you'd never know were there unless you dropped into one. My heart was racing so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't scream or cry. I didn't have time to. I just froze. The wind howled faintly above me, but down in that chute, it was dead silent. Just the sound of dust settling and my own breathing, loud and fast and panicked. My arms were pinned at my sides by the pack, and I could feel my legs dangling. My feet couldn't touch anything solid. There was nothing below me but air and darkness. I stayed like that for maybe a minute, maybe 5. I don't know. Time does weird things when you're terrified. My mouth was dry, and I could feel the red dust in my nose, my eyes, everywhere. I wanted to scream for help, but I knew no one would hear me. Not out there. Not that far off trail. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. If I fell deeper, no one would find me. Not in time. Probably not ever. Eventually, my brain started working again. I told myself I had to move. Slowly, carefully, I tried to shift. My left shoulder was wedged tighter than the right, and I used that to my advantage. I dug my elbow against the wall of the chute and tried to inch upward. The clay crumbled every time I pressed against it, but I kept trying. Shimmying upward wasn't easy. The chute wasn't straight, it twisted slightly, and every movement felt like I might lose what little hold I had and slide deeper. It took everything I had, every muscle in my arms, my back, my legs straining to push and wedge myself higher. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't lift my head more than a few inches. I had to twist my body and push in these weird angles, 1 inch at a time, each one taking more effort than the last. My boots kept slipping against the walls. Every time I made a little progress, I'd slide back an inch or two. My fingers scraped against rough stone. My knuckles split open. I didn't even notice until later that I was bleeding. I don't know how long it took. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe longer. But finally, I felt air on my face. Real air, not the stale, dry stuff that had filled the chute. I reached up and touched open space. I found a root, just a little thing but strong enough, and used it to haul myself up over the edge. I rolled out onto solid ground and just lay there for a while, breathing dust and staring at the sky. The sun had shifted. I could tell I'd been down there longer than I thought. I was shaking. My hands were filthy and scraped raw. My legs were covered in red clay, and my pack was torn at one of the straps. But I was out. I was alive. I looked back at the hole I'd come out of, and I couldn't believe it. You couldn't even tell it was there unless you were right on top of it. The chute was hidden between 2 crumbling ridges, just a crack in the ground. A little darker than the rest of the dirt. Maybe, but otherwise invisible. I tried marking it with a rock, something, but everything blended together in that dry, red landscape. I felt this deep chill, even in the heat, because if it had swallowed me whole, no one would have ever found me. I stood up, got my bearings, and made my way back to camp. My legs were jelly, and I kept stumbling. I don't even remember the walk clearly, just that it felt like it took forever. The whole way, I kept turning around to try and memorize the spot where I'd fallen. But everything looked the same. Ridges and rocks, dry clay, twisted brush. Nothing to tell one part from another. When I got back, my wife was still in the tent. I cleaned up quietly and didn't tell her right away. I just sat there for a long time, drinking water, staring at the dirt. Finally, I told her what happened. She didn't believe me at first. Who would? I didn't have pictures. There wasn't a scratch on my clothes besides the dirt. But she saw my hands. She saw my face. The next day, I took her out there. Or I tried. I was so sure I knew the spot. I retraced my steps from where I'd left the trail, followed the ridge, past the same rock formations. Everything looked familiar until it didn't. We searched for over an hour, looping around, backtracking, climbing up and down. We never found a chute again, not even close. The whole area looked different in the daylight, less like a place and more like a memory I couldn't quite grab onto. It messed with me, still does. I love caves. I love exploring tight, dark places most people avoid. But this was different. This wasn't a cave. It was like a mouth in the earth, waiting to swallow someone. And it almost did. I wasn't being reckless. I wasn't doing anything extreme. I was just walking. That's the part that gets me. How easy it was to disappear. It made me think about how many people go missing out in places like that. You always assume they must have made some huge mistake, gone off trail, done something stupid. But now I know sometimes the ground just gives way. Sometimes the land itself doesn't want you there. And if it catches you, it doesn't have to try very hard to keep you. I still hike. I still camp. But I stay on the trail now. And when I do go off, I tell someone exactly where I'm going. I carry more gear. I carry a beacon now, something that can send an SOS if I get stuck. I've learned how fast things can go wrong. It's not about fear. It's about respect. Respect for the land, for your limits, for the fact that you're not invincible just because you've done something 100 times before. I've crawled into tight cave systems, rappelled into sinkholes, explored lava tubes, and never felt the way I did in that chute. That was the closest I've ever come to disappearing. And I mean really disappearing. No trail, no witnesses, no sign. Just dust and time and red clay. I think about that moment a lot. That 1 second where my foot hit soft ground and everything dropped out from under me. It taught me something important. You don't get to go wherever you want, just because you want to. Even the wild places deserve your consent. And sometimes, they don't give theirs back. This will probably get buried, but I've never told anyone this. Now seems like as good a time as any, so here it goes. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my family lived in a house my dad built himself. It was out in the middle of nowhere, Indiana, surrounded by fields and woods that stretched far enough to make you feel like you were alone in the world. No neighbors close by, no street lights, just the dark and quiet that comes with being far from town. My parents owned a small business, and sometimes they had clients come out to our place for meetings or work. Over the years, we saw a lot of people, some normal, some not so normal. One visitor stood out from the rest. He came in a black car with dark, tinted windows that didn't reflect anything. The kind of car that makes you wonder who's inside and what they're really doing. He wore all black, black hat pulled low, dark sunglasses even though it wasn't bright outside. The kind of guy who looked like he didn't want to be noticed, but somehow managed to make everyone notice him anyway. The first time I saw him, I had this cold, prickly feeling that crawled up my spine and settled deep inside my stomach. It was that kind of fear that isn't loud or sudden, but just quiet and heavy, like the air before a storm. He showed up just for a consultation with my parents. I was nearby, watching from the doorway. The man kept looking at our black Persian cat, Mercedes. She was a big, fluffy cat with deep black fur that looked like it could swallow light. She was my favorite pet, and I always thought she had this calm but mysterious presence. This man's eyes were locked on her, and it felt wrong, like he wasn't just interested in her as a cat, but in something else, something darker. When the meeting ended, the man left without saying much, his car's engine barely a whisper as it disappeared down the long dirt driveway. At dinner that night, my parents and I all admitted we felt off, like something was wrong, but we couldn't say what. The man's visit stuck in the back of our minds like a bad smell you can't wash away. That night, Mercedes started acting strange. She came downstairs very ill, something I'd never seen her do before. She was usually proud and graceful, but then she just looked weak and scared. Over the next few days, she got worse. We took her to the local vet, but no one could figure out what was wrong. She was vomiting a thick, black substance, like tar, and couldn't keep anything down. Watching her like that, sick and scared, was horrible. I remember the last time I saw her alive. She was laying in her favorite spot near the fireplace, but she wasn't calm anymore. She was hissing and swatting at the empty air, like she could see something invisible that was bothering her. I could feel the cold chill run through the room when she let out her last breath. She was gone, and something in the house felt different, darker. After Mercedes died, strange things started happening around the house. It wasn't just little noises or shadows. It was stuff that made you stop and think, what the hell? Footprints showed up in the snow outside, but they didn't lead anywhere or come from anywhere. They just start and then stop, as if whoever made them vanished into thin air. Sometimes in the dead of night, we'd hear noises that made no sense, creaks, whispers, thuds, nothing like what you'd expect in an old house. The wallpaper would be torn down in patches, corners ripped off with no explanation. I remember waking up once and seeing a strip hanging loose, like someone had been angry or scared enough to tear it. Nobody in the family ever admitted to doing it, and it kept happening. My mom, who always had a sensitive side, started acting strange too. She told my dad and me she saw things, shapes in the corners of rooms that disappeared when she looked straight at them. Dark figures, she called them. She stopped going outside as much, spent more time sitting quietly, staring out the window like she was waiting for something or someone. It was hard to watch her like that. For me, the worst part was the asthma attacks. I've been lucky for a long time and hadn't had a bad episode in years. Then, after all these weird things started, my breathing got bad again. One night, when I was really sick, I decided to sleep on the floor next to my mom's side of the bed. I thought if something happened, I could get help faster. Around the bed, there were boxes, old family photos, wrapping paper, Christmas decorations, things that needed to be moved out of the way but hadn't been yet. In the middle of the night, my chest tightened so badly I couldn't catch my breath. I was panicking, gasping for air, tried to reach my inhaler, but couldn't move fast enough. I heard my mom suddenly wake up, screaming something I couldn't understand at first. Then, get away from her. She was trying to reach me, but every box around the bed had somehow been stacked up, blocking her path. It was like a wall made of the boxes, piled up between her and me. She was crying, fighting to get through. I could hear her hands moving the boxes, knocking them over, but something kept pushing them back up. I don't know how long it took her, but eventually she got to me and gave me my inhaler. I could hear her crying all through the night, even after I was calm again. She never told me exactly what she saw that night, and I never asked, but I could tell it shook her to the core. After that, the strange things went on for several more months. We had the house blessed by a local priest, and we tried everything we could think of to make the house feel normal again. Over time, the activity slowed. The noises became less frequent, the footprints stopped appearing, and the feeling of dread lifted just a little. Years later, my brother and his family moved into the house. They say they still hear things sometimes, little creaks and whispers that don't make sense, but nothing like what we went through. I want to believe it was all just our minds playing tricks on us, that maybe grief for Mercedes and the stress of living so isolated made us see and feel things that weren't real. But sometimes when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I swear I can feel that cold, heavy feeling again. Like something is watching, waiting. I don't know what that man wanted or why he seemed so interested in Mercedes. I don't know what he did, if anything, to her. I just know that after he came, everything changed. The house wasn't the same, and none of us were either. I grew up skeptical and logical, but this experience left a mark I can't explain. I don't believe in ghosts or fairy tales, but some things don't have a simple answer. Sometimes the darkness is just real, and sometimes it's right outside your door, waiting to step inside. I'd been on the road for about 8 hours. The reunion was in California, somewhere near the Mojave. I left late because of work and figured I'd drive straight through the night. I was making good time, But once I crossed into the desert, the traffic thinned out fast. After a while, I didn't see any cars at all, just miles and miles of empty roads stretching out in front of me, the high beams cutting through the blackness like a tunnel of light. I had the windows cracked just enough to keep me from getting too comfortable. I didn't want to fall asleep behind the wheel. The warm desert air smelled like dust and dry brush. My music had long since turned into background noise, something soft just to fill the silence. The only other sounds were the steady hum of my tires on the road and the occasional creak from the dashboard. Sometime after 2 in the morning, I realized I was getting low on gas. The needle was flirting with empty, and I hadn't seen a station for at least 100 miles. I started to worry. I slowed down a little, turned off the AC to conserve fuel, even shut off the stereo. It felt like I was squeezing every last drop out of the tank, hoping I'd see something before the car gave up. Then, just when I was thinking I'd have to pull over and sleep in the car, I saw a glow on the horizon. It started as just a soft orange, like a star that had fallen and landed in the sand. As I got closer, I saw it was a small gas station, one of those single pump types of flat-roofed building with flickering fluorescent lights. There were no other cars, no sign of town nearby. Just that gas station sitting by itself like it had been dropped there out of nowhere. The sign said, "Open 24 hours." I pulled in slow, the gravel crunching under my tires. The lights above the pump buzzed quietly. Inside, I could see a man behind the counter, not moving, just standing there. He looked old, skin like dried leather, white stubble, eyes glassy and a little too wide. He didn't blink when I walked in, just stared. I gave a quick wave, just being polite. Pump still work. He nodded. That's all. No smile, no, yeah, sure. Nothing. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a couple 20s, laid them on the counter. His hand came out slow and took the money without a word. Thanks, I said. Still nothing. It felt weird, but I didn't feel threatened or anything. Just off, like maybe the guy wasn't all there. I figured he was half asleep or half senile or both. I walked back out, clicked the nozzle into the tank, and started pumping. The air was dead quiet. The buzzing from the light was the loudest thing around. No crickets, no wind. Just that low electric hum and the slow tick of gas filling the tank. Then the door creaked open behind me. I turned and saw the old man had stepped outside. He looked even smaller in the light, hunched a little, like the desert heat had baked him down over the years. He walked up slow, too close for comfort, and leaned in. I could smell him, old sweat and motor oil. Then, real quiet, he said, "Don't go to the bathroom. Just leave." That's it. No explanation. No change in his face. Just those words, flat and calm, like he was telling me the weather. Then he turned and walked right back inside. I stood there for a second, frozen. I watched him through the glass. He went back to standing behind the counter like he'd never moved. Didn't look at me again. Something about the way he said it. It wasn't panicked or dramatic. It was firm, final, and that made it worse. It felt real, like it was coming from someone who'd seen something too awful to explain. I should have listened. I know that now, but I was curious. And it was that quiet, dry kind of curiosity that makes you forget about consequences. The gas finished pumping, and I left the nozzle in for a second. Then I looked around the side of the building. There was a single door in the back, propped open with a cinder block. The bathroom, a bare yellow light bulb, was swinging overhead, barely lighting the space. The door creaked in the stillness. I shouldn't have gone near it, but I took a step, then another. When I got close enough to see inside, my stomach dropped. There was a man tied to a chair, duct tape across his mouth, shirtless, covered in sweat and dirt. His hands were bound behind him, ankles taped to the chair legs. His eyes were wide, wild. He jerked his head when he saw me, like he was trying to scream through the tape. His whole body trembled. I just stared at him. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The scene didn't make sense. It looked like something out of a movie, but too real, too raw. Then I heard something, a soft noise, maybe a footstep inside the building. I snapped out of it. I bolted back to my car, ripped the door open, and got inside. I didn't even close the gas tank flap. I floored it, gravel kicking up behind me as I tore back on a highway. The wheels screeched a little when I turned too sharp, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. My heart was hammering. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights, someone chasing me. But the road behind me was black. I drove for maybe 30 miles before I saw the lights of a town. It wasn't big, just a cluster of buildings with a diner, a few houses, and a tiny sheriff's station. I pulled in and parked right in front of the station. Inside, there was a young deputy at the desk. I tried to explain what I saw, but the words came out jumbled. I was shaking. Finally, I just said, "There's a man tied up at that gas station. Back bathroom. He's alive." That got his attention. He called me unit, then made me sit down and go over everything again, slower. I told him about the gas station, the old man, what he whispered and what I saw. I gave them the location as best I could remember it. Mile markers, turns, the last highway sign I saw. 2 more officers came in, listened, and then the 3 of them left in a cruiser. I sat there for maybe an hour. They gave me water. I tried to stop my hands from shaking. The adrenaline was fading, and the fear started to settle in deep. My stomach hurt. My head was pounding. Then the cruiser came back. The older cop walked in, face hard. He looked tired already. "You sure this is the place?" he asked me. "Yeah, it's the only station out there. I swear." He nodded once. "We found it. Station's there. Lights were off. No cars. No people. Nobody inside. What about the bathroom?" He paused. "We found blood. A lot of it. On the floor. No chair. No man. No tape. Just blood." I didn't know what to say. My brain was trying to make it make sense, but it didn't. It couldn't. "Somebody cleaned it out?" He shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe whoever did it had help. Maybe they saw you and got spooked." I asked if they were going to search the area. He nodded. "We'll send people out. Get state troopers, maybe dogs if we can. But we'll be honest with you. Out there, in the desert, whoever did this is probably long gone." They took my statement again, let me sit in the back of the station for a while. Eventually, the sun came up. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just kept thinking about that man's eyes. The way he looked at me, like I was his last shot. I kept wondering if I should have done more. Untied him, gotten him out, but there was no way to know if someone else was there, if they were watching me. I left the next morning. They thanked me for coming forward, said they'd keep me updated. That was 3 years ago. I never heard back. I called once, a few weeks later. Got some woman who said the case was still open. That was it. I didn't push. Didn't want to. I didn't want to be part of it anymore. I just wanted to forget. But I still think about it, especially at night, when it's quiet and dark and I can't sleep. I think about that gas station, that man's eyes, and the way the old guy whispered to me. Sometimes I wonder, if he hadn't warned me, would I have walked in there? Would I have disappeared too? I don't drive at night anymore, not through the desert, and I always fill up before I go. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my family lived in this quiet little neighborhood that felt almost hidden away from the rest of the world. It was a small cul-de-sac with only a handful of houses, each spaced far enough apart that you could almost imagine you were alone in the middle of nowhere. Our house sat at the end of the street, and it had this huge backyard that stretched back far beyond what you'd expect for a suburban home. The yard was mostly grass, but in one far corner, there was this old, rusted-out trailer. It wasn't a camper or anything like that. It was one of those flat trailers people use to haul dirt bikes or ATVs. The kind with a metal floor and no walls. The trailer had been sitting there so long it was covered in rust, and parts of it were bent or broken. That corner of the yard was always weird. Even during the day, it felt off. The grass around it was patchy, and no matter how much my parents tried to get the yard looking nice, that spot always seemed darker, like the sunlight just didn't want to reach there. Our dog, a big golden retriever, wouldn't go near that corner either. Sometimes when we were playing in the backyard, he'd be perfectly fine running around, but if he caught sight of that trailer, he'd stop, stare, and growl low in his throat before turning and running back to the house. My 2 younger sisters shared a bedroom on the other side of the house. They were both a couple of years younger than me, and sometimes they'd come sleep in my room if they were scared. They told me it was because they saw weird lights in their room. Small, flickering lights that would appear and disappear without any clear source. My parents didn't really believe them. They said it was probably the street lights outside, shining in through the curtains, or maybe reflections from passing cars. So, my sisters got used to trying to ignore the lights. but they still sometimes ended up in my room in the middle of the night, clutching their blankets and whispering about how strange their room felt. One night, when I was probably 9, I woke up with this feeling in the pit of my stomach that I can still remember clearly. It was like a cold, angry presence, not something I could see, but something I could feel pressing down on me. It was the kind of anger you get when you accidentally step on someone's foot, but a million times worse. It was heavy, like someone standing over me, furious. The feeling was so strong, I didn't even dare open my eyes at first. After a while, I gathered enough courage to sit up in bed. That's when I saw the shape of a person standing in the doorway of my room. The shape was mostly dark, like a shadow, but I could see one clear, red, glowing light near its face. It looked exactly like the red cherry at the end of a cigarette. Both my parents smoked, so I thought maybe one of them was standing there, but something about it felt wrong. The figure didn't move or say anything, and the room was completely silent except for the faint sound of my own breathing. I sat up and called out, "Mom? Dad?" But there was no answer. The shape just stood there. After a few seconds, the red light disappeared, and the figure slowly faded away. I remember feeling frozen with fear. I pulled the covers over my head as fast as I could and curled into a tight ball, hoping whatever it was would leave me alone. Then, just when I thought I was safe, I felt something tug at the blankets at the foot of my bed. It was a gentle but deliberate pull, like someone was trying to grab the covers. I didn't dare move. I held the blankets as tight as I could, afraid that if I let go, whatever was there might grab me. The tugging stopped after a moment, but I was so scared I couldn't fall asleep right away. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They looked at each other and said they had been asleep all night, and it must have been just a bad dream. I wanted to believe them, but I knew what I saw was real, even if I couldn't explain it. Over the years, that house gave me nightmares, especially the corner where the garage had been turned into a den. The den was a small room right off the kitchen, and from the outside, it looked like a simple addition to the house. But to me, in my dreams, it was a black hole, a place where the air grew heavy and the shadows seemed to move on their own. The den was on the main floor. Our house was a single story, but in my dreams, I'd find myself running downstairs into that dark room, as if the house had more levels than it really did. I knew if I got too close to that black hole, something terrible would reach out and grab me. I didn't just dream about the den. I dreamed about other houses in the neighborhood too. In those dreams, the houses seemed alive, like they were watching me. I tried to go to them for help, but instead of safety, I'd feel myself slipping away, like I was trapped and could never escape. The feeling of danger wasn't some far-off thing. It was immediate and suffocating. Every time I woke up from those dreams, my heart would be pounding, and it took me a long time to calm down enough to go back to sleep. Years later, I was talking with my younger sister about that house, and we ended up telling our mom about the nightmares we'd both had. That's when things got even stranger. Mom told us she had nightmares too. Not the exact same ones, but very similar. She dreamed about running downstairs into the kitchen, which had cupboards that opened and closed by themselves. And just like me, she saw a man standing in the den, near that black hole I'd always dreamed about. None of us had ever spoken about these dreams before. It was like something in the house had marked us all, leaving a thread of fear that stretched through years and memories. Hearing my mom describe her dreams sent a chill down my spine. The fact that she had the same images, the same feelings of dread, made everything feel more real and more terrifying. I've been back to that neighborhood a few times since we moved away. Every time I step into the area, I get that same uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. The neighborhood looks normal enough. The houses are quiet, the streets clean, and there are no obvious signs of anything wrong. But I can't shake the sense that something is watching, waiting just out of sight. Even during the day, when the sun is bright and the birds are singing, I feel like the shadows are deeper here, the silence thicker. I never saw any ghosts or spirits. It wasn't like those stories you hear on TV or in movies with floating figures or loud noises. What I experienced was subtle, like a weight pressing on my chest, or the feeling that someone or something was angry and waiting. There was no flashing lights, no eerie voices. Just an overwhelming sense of wrongness that I couldn't explain. Looking back, I think the trailer in the backyard was the center of it all. It was like the house and the yard had some kind of memory, something that had settled into that corner and refused to leave. The way the dog would growl at it, the way the grass never grew right around it, the way it seemed to darken the sunlight. It was like a physical reminder of whatever had left that mark on the house. It's hard to explain what really happened in that house. I don't believe in ghosts or curses, but I do believe that places can hold energy. And sometimes that energy isn't good. It's heavy, like sadness mixed with anger, and it sticks to everything nearby. I think about that house often. I think about those dreams and the red light in the doorway. I think about how all of us, my sisters, my mom, and me, felt the same fear, even though we experienced it in different ways. Maybe the house was built on land that had seen something terrible long before we ever moved there. Maybe the people who lived there before us left behind their pain and anger, and it seeped into the walls and the ground. Whatever it was, I don't think that feeling ever really left. It waits quietly, like the rusted trailer in the corner of the yard, patiently waiting for someone to come too close again. And I'm not sure I'll ever want to find out what happens if you do. About 8 years ago, I set out on a road trip that would take me from southern Ontario all the way down the eastern coast of the US, then across the southern states to California. I was alone, driving a reliable old sedan packed with camping gear, clothes, and a few essentials for the trip. I planned to see as much as I could, stopping wherever looked interesting. The idea of camping and hiking in new places was a big part of why I did this. I'm an experienced backpacker, mostly in boreal and mixed forest back home, where rain and cold weather are common, and I know how to handle rough conditions. But this trip took me in a new territory, both literally and figuratively. When I reached Utah, I made a spontaneous decision to spend some time in Bryce Canyon National Park. I had seen pictures before, those towering red hoodoos, the steep cliffs, and the vast open sky. I wanted to hike through the canyon and camp overnight near the bottom, imagining clear skies and the quiet solitude of the desert night. I drove into the park during the late afternoon and parked near one of the trailheads that led down into the canyon. My pack was heavy, filled with all the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water. I had plenty of water, which I knew would be important in such a dry place. The air was dry and warm, but there was something different about the light, the sharp edges of the rocks, and the way the wind blew dust across the trails. It was nothing like the thick forest I was used to, where the ground is soft with pine needles and moss. Here, the dirt was hard, cracked, and dusty. The plants were scrubby, sparse, and tough, clinging to life in this harsh environment. The hike down into the canyon was steep, but not difficult. The trail switched back through bright orange and red rock, with views opening up behind me as I descended. I kept an eye on the sky, which was mostly clear, but far off to the west, I noticed a line of dark clouds building. I didn't think much of it. Where I come from, rain clouds are a regular thing, and you learn to expect sudden weather changes. But in the desert, rain is rare and usually gentle, so I thought it might pass or at worst be a short shower. I found a flat spot near the base of the canyon that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was surrounded by tall, jagged hoodoos that rose like towers, casting long shadows in the fading sunlight. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt with some loose stones. I pitched my tent carefully, anchoring it securely because of the occasional wind gusts. I unpacked my stove and prepared a simple meal, watching as the light dimmed and the shadows grew longer. The air cooled quickly now, a dry cold that felt sharp in my lungs. About an hour after I'd settled, I started to notice a faint sound, a trickling noise coming from a small gully nearby. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, or maybe a small stream hidden in the rocks. Then I looked down and saw a thin line of water running over the dusty ground, just a tiny trickle moving past my feet. I didn't worry at first. Water is a common sight in the forest when it rains, and little streams start from puddles all the time. But in this dry place, it felt strange. I looked back up toward the sky, and those clouds were definitely getting darker and thicker now. A soft wind had picked up, carrying a cool dampness that smelled faintly like rain. Within minutes, that small trickle of water began to grow. It spread quickly, like someone had turned on a faucet underground. The thin line became a shallow stream, moving faster and wider. The ground beneath my feet, which had been dry and firm, was now softening with mud and wet sand. I took a step back and realized something that sent a chill down my spine. I was standing at the bottom of a canyon that was about to fill with rushing water. The desert floor looked innocent enough, but I remembered that the ground was hard-packed and barely absorbed water. The rain that fell anywhere above would run off quickly down the slopes and cliffs, funneling into this narrow canyon. This wasn't going to be a gentle creek forming. This was going to be a sudden, fast-moving river. I started moving fast, throwing my gear into my pack as the water spread rapidly around my campsite. The small trickle on my feet was now a wide band of flowing water, thick with mud and small debris. The sound changed too, from quiet dripping to a roaring rush. I could hear rocks tumbling in the current, and the wind was picking up, carrying stinging drops of rain. I scrambled up the trail, climbing the steep slope as fast as I could. My boots slipped on a loose rock and mud. The water was rising quickly behind me, turning the trail I had just hiked down into a dangerous, slick slope. Looking down, I could see the area where I had just been. Now completely underwater, the ground washed away, rocks tumbling in the surge. My heart was pounding. I realized that if I had stayed even a minute or two longer, I might have been trapped by this sudden flash flood. The steep canyon walls meant there was no easy escape except the narrow trail I was climbing. If the water had cut me off or swept me away, I wouldn't have stood a chance. Finally, I reached a flatter spot near the rim of the canyon, where the water couldn't reach. I collapsed against a rock, breathing hard, soaked and trembling. The rain was coming down harder now, cold and relentless. The sky was dark, filled with heavy clouds that rumbled in the distance. Lightning cracked somewhere far off, but here it was just the roar of the flood and the rain hammering down on the rocks. I sat there for a long time, watching the water pour through the canyon below. The trail I had just taken was now a river, cutting through the desert with a violence I had never expected. It was a stark reminder of how unpredictable nature could be, especially in places I thought I knew. That night, I stayed near the rim, in a sheltered spot under some overhanging rocks, waiting for the storm to pass. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind howled through the canyon, carrying dust and the scent of wet earth. I was soaked cold and exhausted but safe. The desert had shown me a side of itself I hadn't imagined, the sudden, raw power hidden beneath the calm. I think about that night often, how easily things could have gone wrong. It was a lesson in respect for the land and the weather, especially in places so different from where I grew up. In the forest, rain is normal, expected, and part of every trip. But in the desert, rain can turn the ground beneath your feet into a dangerous trap. I hadn't prepared for that because I hadn't thought about it. That almost cost me everything. A few months before that trip, I had another close call, but this time in the deep woods of Ontario's Algonquin Park. I was hiking late in the season with a small group, familiar with the area and the risks. We were walking a narrow trail surrounded by thick trees, fallen leaves crunching underfoot. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as we rounded a bend and suddenly spotted two small black bears crossing the path just a few feet ahead. They were cubs, young, curious, and unaware of us. They moved slowly, unconcerned, as if they owned the place. We didn't see any sign of mother nearby, but we knew better than to wait and find out. Bears with cubs are extremely protective, and any wrong move could trigger a dangerous reaction. We stood frozen, watching as they crossed the trail and disappeared into the underbrush. Our hearts were pounding, adrenaline flooding through us. The bear's claws were sharp, their strength surprising for such small animals. Even though they were not grizzlies, just two black bear cubs, I knew instinctively that this was a moment to respect their space and get away quietly. We backed off the trail slowly, careful not to make sudden noises or movements that might attract attention. That encounter reminded me that nature's dangers are not just in harsh weather or remote places. They're in the wildlife, too, and sometimes the most ordinary moments can become tense and frightening. Both those experiences, the flash flood in Bryce Canyon and the bear cubs in Algonquin, taught me something important about wilderness and survival. No matter how experienced you are, no matter how confident you feel, the natural world can surprise you. It demands respect, constant attention, and humility. When I finally left Bryce Canyon, I was soaked and exhausted, but I carried with me a new awareness of how quickly conditions can change and how vital it is to stay alert. The desert looked peaceful again the next morning with blue skies and dry rock, but I knew better now. I knew that beneath that calm beauty, danger could arrive in an instant, changing everything. That road trip was one of the most challenging and rewarding adventures of my life, filled with moments of wonder and moments of real fear. And those moments, the ones where you face the raw power of nature and live to tell the story, are the ones that stick with you forever. I'm going to tell you about two things that happened to me. Things I don't think I'll ever forget, no matter how much time goes by. These aren't made-up stories or ghost tales. Nothing spooky or supernatural. Just real-life moments that shook me to my core. When I was younger, my family lived in an apartment complex. My mom managed it, so she was always around, fixing things or talking to tenants. The building wasn't very fancy, but it was home. The day before Halloween, my mom was sitting with us kids, telling us stories to get into the spooky spirit. One story she told wasn't one she made up. It was something she said had happened years before we moved in. She talked about how, in one of the vacant apartments above us, a mother and her two little boys had died. The details were vague, but she said it was some tragic accident. She said that if you were quiet and listened closely, you could still hear footsteps running up and down the hallway above us. Little feet, she said, running fast like the boys were playing tag or racing each other. We were all quiet, listening. The air was still. Then, right at that moment, we heard it. Footsteps, running, up the stairs, fast, clear as day, not soft or far away. They were right above us. My mom's face changed immediately. The light in her eyes flickered and went out. Her calm, easy smile vanished. She was terrified. I could tell because I'd never seen her like that before. She was the one who always made everything okay. She grabbed the phone and called a neighborhood cop who usually patrolled around. Then she called one of the maintenance guys who was on duty. They said they'd come check it out. I stayed back with my younger siblings, heart pounding so loud I thought they might hear it from down the hall. After what felt like forever, the cop and the maintenance guy came back. They had found a woman and two small children inside that vacant apartment. A homeless mother had somehow slipped in through an open window and had been living up there for who knows how long, trying to stay hidden from everyone. The kids were healthy but scared and dirty, and the woman looked worn down from everything she'd been through. That was why we heard the footsteps. Those weren't ghosts or spirits. Those were real kids running and playing just like any other kids would do. My mom never told another scary story after that day. Not because she was afraid, but because the real stories were terrifying enough. Years later, when I was older, I was with my mom again at a different apartment complex she managed. It was a quiet day, no maintenance workers around. So she asked me to come along as she checked the vacant units to see if anything needed fixing before showing them to potential renters. We walked through a few apartments, empty rooms, dusty floors, some peeling paint, nothing out of the ordinary. Then we got to one unit that immediately fell off. The front door was open, not just unlocked, but wide open. I didn't see my mom use the key to open it. It was like the door wasn't locked at all, the lock itself broken. I guess some neighborhood kids had been messing around and left it that way, so I didn't think much about it. I stepped inside, looking around, trying to brush off the uneasy feeling in my stomach. I stood near the window in the living room, staring outside at the cracked sidewalk and the overgrown weeds in the little yard area. The wind pushed thin clouds across the sky, making the shadows shift. I kept hearing little noises, creaks and thumps from the walls and ceiling. Old buildings do that, I thought. Then I heard a scream. It was sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet like a knife. My blood froze. I turned and sprinted toward the bedroom where my mom had gone. I found her standing at the closet door, face pale, eyes wide with horror. Inside the closet was a girl, pale as snow, barely dressed, her nails dug deep in the wall like she was trying to hold herself together to stop from falling apart. She looked terrified, shaking, like she didn't know where she was or who she could trust. My mom told me to go get help. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran toward the office to find the security guard. But as I passed the kitchen, the same room where I had been standing just moments ago, I saw something else. A man tall, about 6'3", running out the back door. His clothes were dark, and he moved fast, disappearing down the street before I could catch up. I chased him for several blocks, maybe 400 or 500 feet, but then I lost him in the maze of alleys and side streets. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. When I stopped, I looked back toward the apartment building, my hands shaking. The girl in the closet was in the middle of being sexually assaulted when we walked in. The man had been hiding there, waiting. He didn't care who saw him or what would happen if he got caught. He was dangerous, and he was right there. The security guard and police came quickly after I got the call out. They took the girl to a hospital and started looking for the man. The building was locked down tight after that. My mom didn't say much, but the look on her face said everything. We were lucky that day. We got there just in time. I've thought about that day a lot since then. About how easily things can go wrong in a place you think is safe. About how close the danger was, how fast it could have been worse. I remember the girl's face, the fear in her eyes, and my mom's quiet strength. We were shaken, but we stayed strong. After that, my mom made sure every door was locked and every window secure. She never took anything for granted again. Neither did I, because sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're real people, real dangers, hiding in plain sight. And those are the stories I carry with me. Not made-up tales or spooky legends, but real moments that left scars you can't see. Moments that remind you to stay alert, to trust your instincts, and to never ignore the sound of footsteps when you're alone. The wind had been picking up for hours before I realized what was coming. At first, it was just the usual forest breeze brushing through the leaves, rustling softly like a gentle whisper in the trees. I was miles into the wilderness in West Virginia, tucked away in a small clearing where I had set up camp for the night. I'd found a single-walled pavilion, a simple wooden roof held up by pillars, no walls to speak of, and pitched my tent underneath it. It felt like a decent enough shelter from the weather and any flying debris. I was alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and the forest floor, the air thick with the damp smell of earth and pine. As the daylight faded, the wind started to change. It grew louder, stronger, the leaves and branches shaking and thrashing, the smell of wet wood carried by the air. I could hear branches cracking somewhere in the distance. I'd heard about derechos before, storms that pack a wall of fast-moving, powerful wind capable of ripping up trees, tossing around anything that wasn't bolted down. But being there, in the middle of all that with no cell signal, no way out, it was a different feeling entirely. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The sky darkened rapidly, the light from a fading sun swallowed by churning clouds moving faster than any storm I'd ever seen. The wind roared, the trees swaying wildly, the whole forest shaking like it might come down any second. It was getting hard to stay calm. I retreated into my tent under the pavilion, zipped up tight, but I knew it was only a thin barrier. The pavilion's roof above me rattled as branches thudded against it. Leaves and dirt whipped around the edges. Water dripped from the wooden beams and pooled here and there where the ground sloped. The forest beyond was a blur of moving shadows and swaying trunks, the trees groaning and snapping under the power of the storm. Then I heard it, a sound that froze my blood. Heavy, fast footsteps clacking against the cement slab of the pavilion's floor. Long, sharp claws tapping, clicking with a rhythm that couldn't be anything but a large animal pacing. The sound was closer than I wanted it to be. Then came a loud snort, followed by a low growl, the unmistakable warning of a bear. My heart jumped, pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The bear had found shelter under the same pavilion I was in. It was trapped here with me, scared and angry and confused by the storm, and now pacing in wide, heavy circles around my tent. I tried to keep quiet, not to make any sudden moves, but the bear's footsteps were relentless. Tap, tap, tap on the concrete, mixing with the endless gusts howling through the open sides of the pavilion. Each tap seemed louder, sharper. The smell of wet fur and musk filled the air, making the tension almost unbearable. The bear's breaths came out in angry huffs, its body tense and restless. I could see the shape of it moving around me. Shadowy, massive, close enough that every clawed step echoed with a terrifying presence. I wasn't just near a bear. I was trapped with it in this tiny shelter. No walls between us, only the thin fabric of my tent. I wanted to scare it off. I whispered and shouted, clapping my hands and banging on the tent walls. But the storm was so loud and the bear so riled up that it didn't care. It just kept circling, leaving the pavilion briefly only to come right back, just as angry as before. I felt my hands start to shake, cold creeping in despite my layers. The storm soaked everything, my clothes, my gear, the ground beneath me. I pulled out my hunting knife, the only weapon I had, and duct taped it tightly to my hand so I wouldn't drop it if I needed to defend myself. I wasn't sure what I could do if the bear actually attacked, but I wasn't about to give up without a fight. The hours dragged on. The storm didn't let up. Trees crashed somewhere in the forest, thunder roared overhead, and the pavilion rattled under the unrelenting wind. Every so often, the bear's claws would scrape the concrete, the sound like a sharp reminder that it was still there, still watching, still angry. The tension was suffocating. I didn't dare move or make noise. I just sat, frozen, heart racing, waiting for the storm to pass, waiting for the bear to lose interest or find another way out. I kept telling myself this would end. It had to. At one point, I thought I saw its eyes reflecting in the dark near one of the pavilion's posts. Wide, black, unblinking. They stared at me like the forest itself had turned alive and angry. Time blurred. Minutes became hours. The storm's fury slowly started to ease. The wind dropped from a howl to a moan. The rain lightened to a drizzle. The bear finally stopped pacing and retreated to the far edge of the pavilion, where it laid down with heavy, trembling breaths. I stayed still, watching, until the first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon. Only then did I dare unzip my tent and peek outside. The bear was gone. The forest was quiet but raw. Branches and trees lay broken and torn, debris scattered everywhere. The pavilion had taken some hits, but it stood. I didn't wait for anything else. I packed up my soaked gear as fast as I could, still shaken but alive. My hands were numb and weak from the cold and tension, but I managed to break down camp and hike out as the sun rose. That night, trapped in that pavilion with a raging storm and a furious bear circling just feet from me, I learned what fear really felt like. Not the kind of fear from stories or movies, but the raw, bone-deep kind you feel when survival depends on silence and stillness and hope. No magic, no ghosts, just the cold reality of nature's power and the fragile line between life and death. I don't ever want to be that close to that kind of danger again, but I'm glad I made it through, alive, shaken but wiser, and I never camped in a single-walled pavilion again. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. It was way out in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where you wouldn't see another house for miles, and the only sound was the wind through the trees. The road to get there was long and winding, a narrow dirt path that snaked through thick woods, making me wonder how anyone even found the place without directions. I had booked it through Airbnb as a quiet getaway, hoping to escape the noise of the city and the pressure of everyday life. The pictures online showed a cozy wooden cabin with a stone chimney, surrounded by tall pines and a small clearing. It looked perfect. When I got out of my car, I felt the coolness of the air hit me immediately. The forest smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth. The cabin itself was old but well kept. The wood was dark and weathered, with some moss growing on the roof. I could see a little porch with a couple of chairs and a small table. The door was unlocked, just as the host had promised in their instructions. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the quiet. No sounds from the outside, no neighbors, nothing but the soft creaks of the wooden floor beneath my feet. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a small kitchen area with basic appliances, a table with a few chairs, a living room with a couch and a wood stove, and a bedroom at the back. The furniture was rustic but clean, the kind that made you feel like you were somewhere special, not just another rental. I unpacked my things, then took a quick look around. Everything seemed to be in order, and I was glad I had brought a few groceries since the nearest store was supposed to be miles away. As night began to fall, I lit a fire in the stove and settled on the couch with a book. The cabin was cozy, the fire crackling and the shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, the darkness settled deep and thick, the kind that makes you realize how far you are from the world. I kept the lights on in the living room and the bedroom, trying to push away that strange feeling that comes with being alone in the woods. After a while, I decided to check out the small guest book I found sitting on the kitchen table. It was a plain notebook with a leather cover, old but well cared for. The pages were filled with neat handwriting from previous renters. Most of the entries were normal. People talking about how beautiful the area was, how peaceful their stay had been, and recommending the cabin to others. Some described hikes they had taken or wildlife they had seen nearby. I read through a few, smiling to myself at the idea that so many strangers had passed through this quiet place before me. Then, as I flipped further into the book, the tone of the entries began to shift. Several pages were filled with notes from people who said they had woken up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was watching them. One person wrote about waking up and seeing a shadow at the foot of their bed, just standing there, silent and still. Another said they had felt a presence in their room, but never saw anyone. These entries were brief but unsettling, each one signed with a date that stretched back over several months. I put the book down, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the fire. It was hard to explain the unease growing inside me. I told myself it was just nerves, that the stories were probably just people imagining things or messing around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went back to the book, reading more carefully. The handwriting was different in each entry, but they all described the same strange experience. Waking up and feeling someone standing over them, watching, never moving or speaking. Then, almost at the end of the book, I found an entry that made my blood run cold. The date at the top was the next morning, the morning after my stay. I was sure it had not been written before, because the ink was fresh, the page uncreased and clean. The handwriting was sharp, hurried, and the words were short but clear. I woke up to someone standing at the side of my bed, watching me sleep. The room was dark, but I could see a shape. I tried to move, but couldn't. I screamed, but no sound came out. I don't know who it is or what they want. I left as soon as I could. I stared at the page for a long time. My mind was racing. There was no way this could have been written before I arrived, yet here it was, right in the guest book, with the date clearly marked after my stay. My heart was pounding. I went back to the previous entries, reading them again, feeling the weight of every word. I sat there in the dim light of the cabin, the fire now reduced to glowing embers, the silence outside pressing in on me. I tried to convince myself that it was a prank, someone trying to scare the next guest, but the thought didn't help. I realized I hadn't heard anything that night. No noises, no footsteps, nothing. But the idea that someone might have been in the cabin, watching me without my knowledge, was terrifying. I packed my things immediately. The air felt thick, like it was closing in on me. I didn't stop to grab anything extra. I just locked the door behind me, got in my car, and started the long drive back the way I came, my headlights cutting through the darkness of the forest road. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something there, but there was nothing. On the drive back, I couldn't stop thinking about the guest book and the people who had written those entries. Who were they? Had they been telling the truth? And who had written that final entry, dated after my stay? I thought about calling the host, but I didn't want to explain what I had found. I wasn't sure if they would believe me, or worse, if they were involved. When I finally got home, I didn't tell anyone where I had been or what I had found. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet place to get away, but now I couldn't stop thinking about the feeling of being watched, the stillness of those shadowy shapes, and the words written in the guest book. I never stayed in another remote cabin after that. I couldn't forget the way the air had felt heavy in that place, like there was someone else there, just out of sight. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the image of those words, the ones written for the guest who came after me, out of my head. The thought that someone else had gone through the same fear, and that they might have been right there, watching me, was more real than any ghost story. It was the kind of fear that stays with you because it makes you question what's really safe, what's really real, and whether some places are better left alone. Back in the spring of 1994, I took a trip out to Suches, Georgia, with a small group of friends. Suches is one of those quiet, off-the-beaten-path spots in the North Georgia mountains. Nothing fancy, just deep woods, a few clearings, and plenty of space to stretch out and disappear for a while. We'd gone camping there a few times before, and the sites were pretty primitive but well-defined, with large spaces between them, so you could feel like you were alone, even if there were others around. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the thick pine and oak trees. The air had that fresh, slightly damp smell that spring brings, the mix of moss, wet earth, and budding leaves. When I pulled into the parking area, I saw that a couple of good friends, Kate and Ted, were already set up. They were one of the pairs I camped with the most. Kate was always energetic and friendly, and Ted was a big, solid guy who didn't say much, but was reliable as hell. I was in a good mood, hiking up the short trail to their campsite with my pack bouncing on my back, whistling a little tune under my breath. As I rounded the last bend and came into their clearing, something felt off. It was subtle at first. Kate was standing near the tents, but she wasn't her usual bright self. Instead, she had this wide-eyed, almost scared look. I mean, she was trying to hide it, but I caught it immediately. Then I noticed Ted standing a little ways off, near the edge of the campsite, talking to a man I'd never seen before. The guy looked out of place, like something straight out of a nightmare. He was dirty, with wild, unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. His clothes were torn and stained, like he'd been living rough for a long time. He had these eyes that didn't seem to look at you, but right through you. I remembered one of those old news reports about cult leaders. David Koresh was the first name that popped into my head. That's what this guy reminded me of, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Kate saw me looking and whispered, almost in a panic, "This dude won't leave us alone." Her voice was barely audible, and I could tell she was trying not to freak me out, but wanted me to understand the situation. From what I gathered, this man had been camping nearby alone for days, maybe weeks. He was lonely and seemed to latch on at anyone who showed him a bit of attention. Ted had tried to talk to him a few times, but the guy just wouldn't take the hint. It was like he thought we were all his friends now, whether we liked it or not. The day went on, and this guy was all over the place, trying to insert himself in everything we did. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just lonely, maybe a little off mentally. But the more he stayed close, the more uncomfortable everyone became. When we started prepping for dinner, the big event of the trip, our camping tradition, he showed up with a cooler. Most of us had brought food to share: steaks, vegetables, foil-wrapped potatoes, and some beers. But his cooler was something else. He opened it up and showed us his dinner plan: a raw steak floating in water that was stained red with blood. There were a couple of beers next to it, but the whole thing looked so grim and strange that we all just stared, not knowing what to say. Two other friends arrived while this was happening, and their faces said it all. WTF? We tried to keep it friendly but firm. We had our own food, and the guy's presence was making us uneasy. So Ted, being the biggest and most confident, decided to step up and set some boundaries. He approached the man and explained that we had our own space and that our meal was planned carefully. Ted was polite but firm, trying not to escalate things, but making it clear the guy wasn't welcome to join our group. Surprisingly, the man backed off a little after that. He seemed embarrassed, like he finally understood he was intruding. We all felt a bit relieved and even a little sorry for him. Loneliness can mess with people. The night started to settle. We ate, drank, and laughed around our campfire. The woods grew quiet, except for the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant calls of night birds and insects. It was the kind of night where the darkness feels heavy and alive, but in a natural way, not scary, until it wasn't. Out of the shadows came the man. We hadn't seen him for a while, and suddenly he was just there, stepping into the circle of firelight like he belonged. No warning, no knocking or asking. He sat down right in front of the fire, close enough for us all to see him clearly. What made the hair on my neck stand on end was what he held in his hand, a huge Desert Eagle pistol, the kind of gun that's heavy and powerful, the kind you don't mess with. He held it loosely, his finger resting casually on the trigger. No one moved. No one said a word. The fire flickered on his face, showing that wild, haunted look in his eyes. Then, without any change in his voice or expression, he asked if anyone wanted to check out his gun. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. No one dared say yes. Then my friend Dave broke the tension with a simple nope, no thank you. The man just nodded, as if that was the answer he expected all along. He stood up, took his gun, and walked away, disappearing into the darkness without a flashlight or a sound. We all sat frozen, watching until we couldn't see him anymore. About 30 minutes later, from the direction of his campsite came a sudden bright glow. A fire had been set, huge flames licking the night sky, towering over the trees. At first, we thought maybe it was an accident, but then we saw the figure moving in the firelight. The man was hopping around the fire, completely naked, holding a gas can. From our distance, it looked like he was deliberately throwing gas on the fire, making it flare higher and higher. The way he moved was frantic, wild, like some kind of madness had taken hold of him. It was one of those moments where you can't look away, but you know you should. The flames grew hotter, casting long shadows that danced on the trees around us. After about 30 minutes of this strange and terrifying show, the man suddenly stopped. He stood still for a moment, then quietly vanished into the woods. The fire died down as quickly as it had flared, leaving only glowing embers and a strange, smoky silence. We stayed up late that night, none of us able to sleep fully. Every little noise in the woods made us jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. We kept checking our surroundings, making sure our tents were secure, and listening for any sign of the man's return. Morning came slowly, with sunlight filtering through the thick canopy above. We went out to his campsite, half expecting to find something left behind, some clue about who he was or where he'd gone. Instead, all we found was a melted red and yellow plastic gas can, scorched and warped from the fire. He was gone. The rest of our trip passed without incident. We kept to ourselves, sharing stories around the campfire and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to us like a shadow. Despite the strange encounter, we managed to enjoy the woods, the fresh air, and the company. But every once in a while, someone would glance toward the edge of the trees and catch a glimpse of something, or maybe just a trick of the light, and the silence that followed was louder than any words. That experience stuck with me long after we packed up and left Suches. It was a reminder that not everyone who lives in the woods is friendly, and some people carry darkness with them that no amount of kindness can reach. It was real, it was raw, and it was terrifying. I grew up in Wyoming, but for some reason, my family usually went camping in Colorado. I guess the mountains, they were just a little different, maybe a little bigger, or the air smelled different. We had this old 1976 Ford Country Squire, a big wood-paneled station wagon that was as slow as a turtle, but carried all our camping gear and people comfortably. I was about 12 years old, and it was the early 80s. The memories from that trip still stick with me, like it happened yesterday. We were camped somewhere high up in the Colorado mountains. The night was cold, colder than I expected. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, shivering under my sleeping bag. The kind of cold that gets into your bones and makes you feel like you can't breathe right. I was in the tent with my brother, who was maybe a year or two younger than me. He was sound asleep, curled up beside me, but I was freezing. I decided to get out and go warm up in the car. The tent was cramped, and to get out, I had to drag my sleeping bag over my brother. I could hear him groan and mutter something about having to pee, but I knew it was just an excuse. He always wanted to tag along whenever I moved around. I pulled the tent flap open slowly, trying not to wake anyone else, but the cold hit me like a slap. Outside, the world was dark and the sky was a deep blue-black. The only sounds were the wind through the pine trees and the occasional snap of a twig. I stepped out, rubbing my arms to try to warm up. The ground was hard and frosty beneath my feet. I told my brother I was going to the car, but as I started walking, the first signs of dawn began to show up over the mountains. A faint, orange glow stretched across the tops of the pine trees and the rocky ridges. Instead of heading straight to the car, I paused and looked out toward the horizon. The light was soft and beautiful, the kind of early morning light that makes you feel peaceful even when the air is freezing cold. My brother wasn't convinced. He came out behind me, still yawning and rubbing his eyes. He asked what I was doing, and I told him I thought I'd stay up and watch the sunrise. I pointed to the light on the mountain. I was excited to see the day start because it made me forget how cold I was. He frowned and said, "That's not where the sun comes up. It comes up over there," and pointed in a different direction. I rolled my eyes, knowing he was just trying to argue because he was a Cub Scout and liked to be right. I was the older sibling, and it felt like my job to prove him wrong. So I argued back, telling him the sun had to be coming up where I saw the light. Our voices were quiet but loud enough to wake our parents, who were still sleeping in the other tent nearby. My dad poked his head out just enough to see the early light, and then his face changed. It wasn't just the dawn light. That bright orange-red glow was wrong, too bright and too angry for a simple sunrise. I remember the way his eyes narrowed, and he pulled the tent flap open wider, standing up fast. I could tell right away from the way he looked that he knew exactly what it was, a forest fire. The glow wasn't peaceful anymore. It was bright and spreading across the mountain. The sky behind it had started to turn dark orange, like the whole world was on fire. The smell of smoke was faint but sharp, even that early in the morning. I felt a chill run through me, but it wasn't from the cold anymore. It was fear. Without any delay, my dad began packing things up. We didn't waste time taking out anything from the tent or gathering more supplies. We just collapsed the tent as fast as we could, the poles banging against the ground, and shoved it and everything else into the back of the Ford. I remember the rough feel of the canvas and the crunch of the tent poles mixing with the rustle of sleeping bags and backpacks as we shoved everything in. My mom was quickly waking up too, moving fast but calm. My brother looked scared but tried not to show it. My dad climbed into the driver's seat, and the engine started with a grumble. The car was loaded, and we were ready to go. Dad didn't say much, just told us to buckle up and hold on. We headed down the narrow gravel road that led out of the campsite. The road was winding and steep, and the kind of place where if you lost control, you could easily fall off into a canyon or worse. There were no guardrails, just the dirt road hanging over the edge. The dust from the tires floated in the still, smoky air as we drove, and every few minutes, my dad glanced over his shoulder at the orange glow chasing us down the mountain. The fire was growing fast. The smoke thickened with every turn we took, filling the windows with a grayish haze. My throat started to scratch, and my eyes watered a little. I try not to look out too much because it made the whole situation feel worse. The trees on the mountain sides were dark shapes against the red sky, and every now and then, the orange flames would flare up higher between the branches. Dad kept his foot heavy on the gas, but the road was rough and slow going. He talked quietly, saying everything was going to be fine, that we were ahead of the fire, but I could hear the tension in his voice. The car's headlights cut through the smoke, but the world outside seemed like it was closing in around us. After what felt like forever, we saw the flashing lights of a game warden's truck coming out from a side road. Dad pulled the car over and rolled down the window. The warden spoke with Dad for a few minutes. He told us the fire was spreading faster than anyone expected and that he was going around evacuating campers from other sites. I remember the warden's eyes looking worried but trying to stay calm. We got back on the road. still moving as fast as we could. The fire was behind us, but the smoke was thick and choking, and the danger felt real and close. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the trees were burning, how fast the flames could jump from one place to another. The wind shifted, and suddenly the smoke pushed forward, blanketing everything in a dark cloud. The car's heater was on full blast, but the heat inside the car was nothing compared to the cold fear growing in my chest. I kept looking out the window, watching the mountain get smaller behind us, and hoping the fire wouldn't catch us. My brother sat quietly, clutching his jacket, not saying a word. We didn't stop until we were safely down the mountain, back on the main highway. The air was clearer here, and the sky looked less like it was burning. My parents finally let us relax a little, and I remember the relief washing over me like a wave. When we got home, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we came to being trapped up there. I had seen people on the news talking about wildfires since then, the way fire jumps and moves so fast it can trap people in minutes. I'd watch those videos and feel a cold prick of fear in the back of my mind, remembering that morning when my family had to escape a forest fire in the Colorado mountains. That trip taught me a lot about how quickly things can go wrong out in the wild. You think you're safe, but nature has its own plans, and sometimes you have to move fast or risk losing everything. I don't go camping without thinking about that fire and the smell of smoke in the cold mountain air. It's a quiet reminder that no matter how much you plan or how strong you feel, sometimes survival depends on luck and quick decisions. Now, whenever I see footage of wildfires out west or in Canada, I feel a tiny part of me tense up. It's that memory of that bright red glow over the mountain and the panic in the car as we race down that winding road, the heat of the fire chasing us all the way home. It's a feeling that never really leaves you. I live in a small town where everything feels close and easy to reach. One of the places I go to pretty often is Walmart. It's not just because it's convenient, but because it's really close to where I live. Whenever I need anything, I usually just walk there. It's less than a mile from my place, so it's a quick walk. There's this trail that leads behind the store, then wraps around the side, and finally brings you out to the front entrance. The whole path is kind of strange because it's surrounded by a mix of trees and bushes, giving it a sort of forest-like feel even though you're right next to a big parking lot and a busy street. One evening, my boyfriend and I decided to walk over to Walmart to pick up a few things for root beer floats. It was late, not too late, maybe around 10 p.m. The sky was dark, but there were still street lights lighting the trail, so we weren't completely in the dark. The air was cool, a little crisp, and there was a faint smell of damp leaves and earth mixed with the distant exhaust from cars passing on a main road. The trail was quiet, except for the sound of our footsteps on the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As we walked, something caught my eye near the edge of the trail. Just off to the side, in the shadows cast by the trees, I noticed a dog. It was black, completely black, and it was sniffing around on the ground like it was searching for something. At first, I thought it was just a stray dog that wandered around the neighborhood. It didn't seem aggressive or threatening. My boyfriend and I slowed down a bit to watch it. The dog didn't make a sound. It just moved silently, its nose close to the ground, as if it was following a scent trail only it could detect. The moonlight barely touched it, so its dark fur blended into the shadows. I joked, half to myself and half to my boyfriend, what if it's some sort of creature? I was teasing, just trying to lighten the mood. The idea was silly, but the night had that kind of strange energy, so I said it anyway. At that exact moment, the dog's head snapped up sharply. It turned its head all the way around to look directly at us. The way it moved was unnatural, like it was more aware of us than any normal animal would be. Then before we could even blink, it took off running. And I don't mean a normal dog run. It was faster than anything I had ever seen. Not just a sprint, it was like it disappeared in a blur, like the Flash running past you. The speed was so sudden and so fast, it felt like the air itself got sucked out around it. My boyfriend and I stood frozen for a few seconds, watching where the dog had gone, but it was gone. Just vanished like it was never there. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Not from fear exactly, but from the shock of how fast and strange that was. We kept walking, but the quiet of the trail felt heavier after that. I couldn't shake the image of the dog's head whipping around to stare at us, like it was measuring us in some way. We got what we needed from Walmart and headed back home, but that moment stayed with me. A couple months passed, and I pretty much forgot about the dog. Then, one day, my neighbor came over to talk. She's someone who doesn't scare easily or exaggerate things. So when she told me about seeing a black dog near the back of Walmart, I paid attention. She said she and her son had seen it roaming around the forested area behind the store. The weird part, she said, was when the dog noticed them, it took off running at a speed that made her feel like she'd seen something impossible. She described the speed the same way I had seen it, too fast to be real. I tried telling myself it was just coincidence. Probably a stray dog or maybe two different dogs, nothing supernatural. But the way she described it made me uneasy. The speed wasn't something normal dogs could do. Plus, the way she described the dog's blackness, almost like it was an absence of light rather than fur, felt familiar. It was exactly what I'd felt that night. Then, a few weeks after that, my boyfriend came home from work looking unsettled. He rarely gets spooked, but this time was different. He told me he saw the dog again while walking near the trail behind Walmart. This time he was alone, and it was darker than the first time I'd seen it. He said the dog was standing still, just watching him from the edge of the trees, its eyes barely visible. He swore the dog didn't look like a normal dog at all. The blackness of its body seemed to swallow up the light around it, making it look like a void shaped like a dog. And then, without warning, it ran. The speed was the same as the other times, impossibly fast, like it vanished into thin air. My boyfriend was shaken because this dog wasn't just strange, it was something else. Something beyond explanation. At this point, I was genuinely freaked out. Not by the idea of ghosts or monsters, but by something that felt too real to ignore. This wasn't a dog that belonged in the neighborhood. It wasn't a normal animal. It moved like a shadow given shape, and its speed was beyond anything natural. The blackness wasn't fur. It was like looking into a hole where light didn't exist. The trail behind Walmart became a place I avoided. I still needed to go there sometimes, but I took the longer route around the front and parking lot instead. Even in daylight, the forested edges of the trail seemed ominous. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. When I closed my eyes, I could still see the dog's head turned toward me, that cold, dark gaze staring out of nothingness. I started noticing little things too. Sometimes when I was outside at night near my house, I'd catch glimpses of black shapes moving quickly just out of the corner of my eye. They were gone before I could fully see them, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I never saw the dog near my house, but I felt like whatever it was could be anywhere nearby. I don't think it's a ghost or a demon. I think it's some kind of animal, or maybe something that looks like an animal but isn't. It blends into the darkness and moves like nothing else can. I try to research strange black dogs or animals that can move that fast, but there's nothing that really fits. The most unsettling part is how it never made a sound. No growls, no barks, no footsteps, just silence and speed. It was like it wasn't just running, but tearing through the air, almost like it was slipping between worlds or something. I know that sounds crazy, but the way it looked and moved didn't match anything real I've seen before. After the last sighting, I stopped walking near that trail at night altogether. I tell myself it's safer. I don't want to risk running into whatever that thing is. It's not friendly. It doesn't want to be seen. But I also can't stop thinking about it. Like it's waiting, watching from the shadows. It feels like it's part of the darkness itself. Something made from the absence of light. Now, every time I walk near the edge of the forest, I hold my breath and look carefully into the shadows. The dog might be out there, watching again, waiting for the next time it can run like a flash, disappearing into the night faster than any I can follow. And maybe, just maybe it's not alone. I set out for Desolation Canyon in April, thinking I was prepared. I've been pack rafting for years, paddling through tough water, and this stretch of the Green River felt like a manageable challenge. I knew the risks, sure, but I figured I was careful enough, experienced enough to handle it solo. I was alone on this trip, and looking back, that was the first dumb choice I made. The morning was cold, sharp in that early spring way where the air feels clean but unforgiving. I had my gear packed carefully: dry bags, extra clothes, a small stove, food, water, and my in-reach device strapped to my vest just in case. I launched my raft in the water, the river moving slow in some spots, faster in others, and I paddled downstream, feeling the current carry me. The canyon walls rose high, red and rugged, casting long shadows across the water. It was beautiful, quiet, wild, and isolated in a way few places are. At first, everything was going smoothly. The river was cool but calm, and I was moving with a steady rhythm, navigating small rapids and riffles with the skill I thought I had. The pack-craft felt light, responsive, perfect for the narrow twists of the canyon. But about halfway through the day, I reached a small, shallow riffle. It was nothing major, just a quick patch of white water over some exposed rocks, maybe a foot deep. Normally, this wouldn't have been a big deal. I crossed riffles like this many times before without trouble. But then, I hit a rock in just the wrong way. My paddle caught on an underwater boulder, and before I knew it, I tipped over. I was underwater, cold water rushing around me, and my first thought was to get back into the raft. I flipped the pack craft upright, reached for the cockpit, and tried to climb in. But that's when the pain hit me. I felt a sharp, burning snap in my right shoulder. Something had dislocated. I couldn't move it properly. Panic started to rise as I realized my paddle was still stuck, wedged against a rock, and my shoulder was screaming in pain. I tried to pull myself back into the raft, but my injured arm made it impossible. I was in the water, the current pulling at me, not deep enough to stand, but too deep to put my feet down and get solid footing. The cold was creeping in fast. I kept a grip on my boat with my left hand, trying to stay calm, but the pain and the cold started to weigh on me. My head was pounding, and I realized I must have hit it pretty hard when I fell. There was blood streaming down my face, mixing with the cold river water. I wiped it away, but the cold water kept soaking my clothes and chilling me through. I forced myself to swim toward the shore, dragging the pack raft behind me. The shore felt impossibly far, and every movement burned in my shoulder. My hands were stiffening up from the cold, and I struggled to grip the raft tightly. When I finally reached the bank, I collapsed onto the rocks, shivering uncontrollably. The cold was eating through me, my body shaking so hard I could barely control my movements. I tried to pull myself up to dry land, but my shoulder throbbed with every motion. The sun was starting to dip behind the canyon walls, and the temperature dropped even more quickly. I knew I needed to make camp, start a fire, dry off, and warm up. I struggled to pull out my lighter and matches from my dry bag, but my fingers refused to work. The cold had taken over, numbing my hands so badly that I dropped the matches more than once. I tried to pull out my phone, but my fingers were shaking and weak. The pain in my head was growing worse, and the blood kept dripping down my face and neck. I sat there trying to keep a grip on reality, hoping someone might come by on the river. Maybe another boater, a fisherman, anyone. But the canyon was silent except for the sound of the river rushing past. There was no one. I was alone, injured and freezing. Time passed slowly and my body was shutting down. My teeth chattered, my lips turned blue, and my thoughts grew foggy. I tried to remind myself that I had my in-reach device. It was a small beacon of hope in this nightmare. I managed to pull out and hit the SOS button, but even that simple task was a struggle. My hand was shaking so hard it took several attempts to press the buttons correctly. After that, I just lay back on the rocks, shivering and waiting. The canyon grew dark and cold, and my strength faded. I couldn't move much, couldn't keep my eyes open for long. Every breath felt like a battle. I don't know how long I waited before I heard the sound of a motor. It was faint, distant at first, but then it got closer. I barely had the strength to wave, but I managed to lift my arm just enough to get their attention. The rescue boat came to a stop beside me, and they pulled me out of the cold water. By the time they got me to the hospital, I was hypothermic, my body struggling to keep warm. I couldn't even speak properly. The doctors told me I had a hairline fracture in my skull from hitting my head, a dislocated shoulder, and severe hypothermia. I stayed in the hospital for several days. recovering, and realizing how close I'd come to something far worse. That trip changed everything for me. I never boat alone anymore. The river is beautiful and wild, but it's also unforgiving. Experience isn't enough when things go wrong, and being alone in a place like that is just too dangerous. I learned the hard way that even small mistakes can become life-threatening when you're out there by yourself. Desolation Canyon wasn't a monster or a ghost. It was just the river, the rocks, and the cold. And I was lucky to make it out alive. From then on, I made a rule: no solo trips on rivers like that. I always have a buddy or someone who knows where I am. No amount of experience is worth risking your life alone in the middle of nowhere. The river doesn't care if you're skilled or confident. It only cares if you're prepared and not alone. I'm going to share exactly what happened on that camping trip in the Stanislaus Forest outside Yosemite. It was a double date with two other friends, me and my girlfriend and another couple. We were all excited for a weekend away, a chance to get out of the city and into the quiet wilderness. I've camped all my life, so I was the one who picked the spot. I found it on freecampsites.net, a free spot at the bottom of a massive gorge, and that's part why it seemed perfect. The drive down took about an hour, winding along narrow, twisty roads that dropped steeply down the canyon. We got to the bottom just before sunset. There are two campgrounds along the river that runs at the bottom. The first one was right at the base of the descent, but when we pulled in it was packed, cars, tents, people all around. So we drove another mile or so to the second campground, which was completely empty. The place felt almost too quiet. We picked a spot halfway between the dirt road and the riverbank. The site was separated from the water by a thick patch of sagebrush and other scrubby bushes. I remember the smell of the sage mixed with the cool river air. It was peaceful at first. We unloaded the gear and set up the tents close together, right near the fire pit with the metal grate for grilling. The ground was mostly dirt with patches of grass. It looked like people had camped there before, but it was rough, not groomed or maintained. As we started setting up, some odd things caught my eye around the campsite. Right by the fire pit, tied to the metal grilling grate with a thick rope, was a big rat trap. It looked old and rusted, like it had been there for a while. I've seen traps in campsites before, but this one seemed out of place, especially the way it was tied down, almost like it was secured so no one could steal it or move it. I thought maybe the previous campers had some rodent problems. Then, down by the riverbank, just a few feet from the water's edge, someone's clothes were laid out on a fallen log. Underwear, socks, a shirt, and pants all spread neatly as if drying. I remember that because it felt strange to see clothes just left there like that. Usually, people pack up their stuff or hang it properly. No shoes, no tent nearby, nothing else around. It was almost like someone had been there, left their clothes to dry, and just disappeared. But we didn't say anything about it. Maybe someone had been swimming earlier or had an accident and came back later. It was weird, but we figured it wasn't our business. As darkness fell, we made a fire and settled in around it, passing around some beers. The sky was clear, the stars bright overhead, and the sound of the river running close by was calming. I sat with my back to the river, facing the dirt road that led back up the hill. My girlfriend and our friend were sitting on the other side of the fire, facing me. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the sagebrush and the dirt. We were talking, laughing a little, just enjoying the quiet night. The usual sounds of the forest surrounded us. The crackling fire, the river, the occasional bird or insect. But then, from over my shoulder, coming from the direction of the river, I heard footsteps. At first, they were soft, slow, almost tentative. I stopped what I was doing and listened closely. The footsteps were definitely human, heavy, deliberate steps like boots on dirt and twigs. I said quietly, almost to myself, "Do you guys hear that?" The footsteps instantly got louder. It sounded like someone was running toward us, boots pounding on the ground, fast and heavy. The sudden noise made everyone jump. I was holding an axe because I had been chopping firewood earlier, and I stood up quickly, gripping it tight. My voice came out sharp, "What the fuck?" The footsteps stopped just as fast as they'd started. Complete silence. We all froze for a moment. scanning the dark space beyond the firelight. The beam of our flashlights cut through the black, reaching out toward the riverbank, but there was nothing there. No shape, no figure, nothing moving. The bushes rustled gently in the night breeze, but no other sound. It was like whoever had been coming at us had vanished. For maybe 10 minutes, we stayed quiet and alert. The fire crackled low as we debated what to do next. We could feel the tension hanging thick in the air. Then, almost from nowhere, we heard sticks breaking, like someone shifting their weight, stepping carefully through the bushes. Not a full run, more like slow, careful movements. Someone adjusting their stance, moving in the shadows just beyond the firelight. That was the moment we all decided enough was enough. We grabbed everything, the tents, gear, firewood chairs, throwing it in the back of my van as fast as we could. No one said much. We just moved. The river was still to our left, the bushes thick and dark. I kept the flashlight trained on the edge of the clearing, watching for any sign of movement. The woods were completely silent except for the sound of our hurried footsteps and the low roar of the river. Once we were packed, I started the van and pulled out of the campground, tires crunching over the dirt road as we left. We didn't stop until we got all the way back up the steep, winding road out of the gorge. As we drove, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or a shadow following us. We didn't see anything, but the feeling stayed with me, like we had been watched the whole time. It wasn't an animal. I've heard plenty of animals while camping: raccoons, deer, coyotes, even bears sometimes. Those sounds are normal, expected. This was different. The heavy boots on dirt, the quick, deliberate footsteps, the way they stopped right when we stood up. It was the unmistakable sound of a person, close and moving in the dark. I've gone camping in all kinds of places, remote forests, backcountry trails, lakesides, and I always feel safe in nature. But that night, in the bottom of that gorge, surrounded by the river and the empty woods, something wasn't right. Whatever was out there didn't want to be seen, but it wanted us to know it was there. The strange things around the campsite, the rat trap tied to the fire grate, the abandoned clothes drying by the river, they all make sense now. Maybe someone had been living rough down there, or someone else had been using the site for something we never saw. Maybe it was a trap set for animals, but it also felt like a warning or a boundary marker. I've never gone back to that spot, and I never will. Some places in the forest are quiet because they're peaceful, but that night, that campground was quiet because something was watching, waiting, just out of sight. And when it finally decided to show itself, even if only with footsteps, it was enough to send us running back up the hill, grateful to leave the river, the bushes, and the dark behind us. I was camping alone that weekend, out in the woods where the trees were thick and the sky barely showed through the canopy. I'd set up my small dome tent in a clearing, the ground soft and covered with a layer of fallen pine needles. It was quiet out there, no hum of traffic or city noise, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of an owl. I'd spent the day hiking, enjoying the solitude, and when night fell, I settled in early with a small camp stove and a simple dinner. Around midnight, nature called in the most basic way. I needed to use the restroom. The tent was small, and the camp's latrine was about 50 feet away, just beyond the tree line. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped carefully through the dark woods. The beam of light cut through the blackness, bouncing off the trunks and fallen branches as I made my way. The air was crisp and smelled like damp earth and pine sap. The ground was soft under my boots, and I could hear the faint crunch of leaves and twigs breaking with every step. The stars peeked through gaps in the canopy, pinpricks of light in the dark. The whole scene felt peaceful, but also somehow heightened, like every sound was sharper in the stillness of the night. After I finished, I turned back toward my campsite. The light from my flashlight flickered as I walked, and I was focused on not tripping over roots or slipping on wet leaves. That's when I noticed something moving near my tent. I stopped and shone the light in that direction. A skunk was there, its black and white fur standing out clearly in the beam. It was sniffing the ground, probably hunting for crumbs or any scraps left behind. I froze for a second, watching it. Skunks are usually shy, and they tend to avoid people, but this one didn't seem scared at all. It lifted its head and looked directly at me. I could see its little black eyes gleaming. The skunk started moving toward me slowly, almost creeping, like it was expecting me to hand over some food. I didn't move. I didn't want to scare it, but I also didn't want it to come too close. Skunks are famous for their spray, and I was sure that if it felt threatened, it wouldn't hesitate to defend itself with that terrible smelling spray. My heart started beating faster. I took a step backward toward my tent. The skunk followed, inch by inch, its nose twitching. It wasn't running yet, just steadily moving closer. I broke into a run the moment I was close enough, sprinting the last few feet and diving headfirst into my tent. The nylon fabric felt cold and rough against my skin as I scrambled inside. I twisted around to grab the zipper and pull it up to shut myself inside and keep that skunk out. But then I saw it. The skunk had stopped right at the tent's entrance. Suddenly it started running full speed toward me, its body low to the ground, intent clear. It wasn't just curious anymore. It wanted in. Panic took over. I fumbled with the zipper, my fingers shaking. The zipper got stuck. I could feel the skunk's shadow grow larger through the thin tent fabric, its movements quick and urgent. My breath was short and shallow. It was like the scene from that Jurassic Park movie, where the little girl is trapped in the kitchen cabinet with the raptor charging. The same raw, terrifying panic. I was desperate, fighting against the stuck zipper, willing it to move. I clawed at the zipper, pulling harder, and then it finally gave way with a small, almost painful snap. I zipped the tent closed just in time. Inside, I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst out of my chest. When I looked down at the zipper flap, I saw a tear where the zipper had caught on the thin fabric flap that covers the opening. The tear was a decent size, and I knew right then I couldn't trust that tent anymore. It was too flimsy, too weak for nights like this. The skunk stayed outside, pacing around the tent for a while longer, but it eventually wandered off into the night. I didn't sleep much after that. I stayed awake, sitting in my sleeping bag, eyes fixed on the tent entrance, listening for any rustle or sign of that skunk or any other creature that might come close. When I got home, the first thing I did was throw the tent away. There was no way I could use something that had almost failed me like that. The tear on the zipper flap was a reminder of how close I'd been to a real problem. I bought a sturdier tent after that, one with heavy-duty zippers and thicker fabric. Even now, when I go camping, I remember that night. The way the skunk moved, the way my heart raced, and how helpless I felt. It's a simple thing, a skunk, but in the middle of the night, alone in the woods, it felt like something much bigger. That moment taught me how quickly things can go from peaceful to panic, and how important it is to be ready for anything when you're out there in the wild. I spent the better part of a year planning my solo trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't some fancy vacation. I just wanted a break from the noise and chaos of the city. The cabin belonged to a friend who hadn't used it in years, and they agreed to let me stay there alone for a week. It was nestled in the middle of a dense forest, miles from the nearest road, without cell service or power. I told myself this was going to be a good chance to disconnect and get back to basics. No screens, no internet, just me and nature. The trip started well enough. I loaded my old Jeep with everything I thought I'd need. Canned food, fresh water, a first aid kit, a lantern, firewood, and a heavy blanket. The last few miles on the dirt road shook the car badly, and the cabin looked more worn than I remembered, but it was solid. Built in the 70s, it had wooden walls thick with age, a small stone fireplace, and a handful of creaky chairs. The windows were grimy, letting in only thin streams of light, but the air smelled clean and sharp like pine needles and earth. I set my things down on the cracked wooden floor, lit the fireplace, and made a simple dinner of canned beans heated on the old stove. The silence was overwhelming at first. No cars, no people, just the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I sat by the fire, sipping a cup of black coffee, feeling a mix of peace and a tiny bit of unease. Out here, there was nothing to hide behind or escape to. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction. The first night passed without incident, though I was careful to lock the door and windows before crawling into the sleeping bag. The wind picked up outside, rattling the thin glass panes, and the chimney creaked with the draft. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing but swaying branches and a patch of moonlight on the ground. I told myself it was probably an animal or the wind playing tricks. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I had a map, but quickly realized the trees all looked the same, and the trails weren't marked. After a couple of hours of walking, I found a small stream and followed it, knowing water usually leads somewhere. The air was thick with the smell of damp moss and decaying leaves, and my boots sank slightly with every step. Occasionally, I'd see a deer or hear the distant caw of a crow. Despite the beauty, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a prickly awareness. Something in the quiet was too quiet, and the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon chopping more firewood and stacking it neatly by the door. I wanted to make sure I was prepared for the cold nights. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, the temperature dropped fast, and I built the fire early. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the crackling noise was comforting. I ate a simple meal, double-checked my supplies, and settled down with a book. But then the noises started. At first, it was a soft scratching on the outside of the cabin, like nails tapping against wood. I froze, listening. The scratching came again, this time near the back door. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it on the outside wall, but there was nothing there. The forest was dark and thick, and I couldn't see more than a few feet past the cabin. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a bird, but my skin was tight and my heart was racing. Later that night, I heard it again, but closer, almost like something was trying to pry the door open. I wasn't about to find out, so I grabbed the small hatchet I brought and stayed wide awake by the fire. I listened to the sounds of twigs snapping, leaves crunching just outside the window. They didn't sound like any animal I knew. They were deliberate and heavy, like a person walking carefully through the brush. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were large, like a man's, and there was only one set. The prints led into the woods and then disappeared near a fallen tree. That was when I felt something shift inside me. Up to that point, I thought I was prepared for solitude and wildlife, but now I wondered if someone else was out there, watching or following me. I stayed inside for most of the day after that. The feeling of being watched never left, and every noise made me jump. I kept the fire going, and every now and then, I peeked out a window. The forest was eerily still, like it was holding its breath again. No birds, no animals, no wind. Just silence. That night, the noises got worse. It started around midnight. The scratching on the door returned, louder and more frantic. Then came the heavy thumping against the walls like someone was pounding their fists or trying to break in. I grabbed my flashlight and hatchet again and moved to the window, shining the light into the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. He wasn't moving, just watching the cabin. His clothes were dark and torn, and his face was hidden by shadows. I didn't recognize him, and I had no idea how long he had been there. I didn't dare open the door or shout. I just stood frozen, holding my breath. The man disappeared as suddenly as he had come. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, the hatchet in my hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, I packed up what I could and prepared to leave. But then I realized the Jeep wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I had no cell phone signal to call for help. The dirt road back to the main highway was at least a mile through the dense forest, and I was alone, with no way to defend myself if that man returned. I decided I had to walk. I packed a small bag with food, water, the hatchet, and the lighter, then locked the cabin door as best as I could and started down the road. The forest was thick and dark, and I moved as fast as I could without making noise. Every rustle and snap of a twig made me glance over my shoulder, but the man didn't appear again. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the main road. I was exhausted and covered in sweat and dirt. I stuck out my thumb, hoping a car would come along. After nearly an hour, a pickup truck slowed and pulled over. The driver was a middle-aged man with tired eyes but a kind face. I told him my story quickly, and he agreed to drive me back to town. Later, when I reported the incident to the local sheriff, they told me the area was known for a handful of homeless people who sometimes camped in the woods, but they had never had complaints of violence or break-ins before. The sheriff promised to check on the cabin and keep an eye on the area. I never went back. Even now, months later, I still think about that man and what he wanted. The silence in the woods, the way the night held its breath, and the feeling that someone had been waiting for me the whole time. But I'm glad I left when I did, and I'm grateful to have gotten out alive. Some places aren't meant for us to be alone. We thought renting a cabin in the woods would be a great way to get away from the city noise and the constant pressure of work and school. My wife, our 2 daughters, and I packed the car and drove about 3 hours out to a remote area that promised quiet, nature, and a break from screens and calls. The place looked great in the pictures the owner had sent. It was a small wooden cabin set in a clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. The owner said it was peaceful, off the grid enough to unplug, but still with some basic amenities. We imagined long hikes, campfires, and board games by the fireplace. The drive was smooth, winding through narrow roads flanked by dense forest. The closer we got, the more isolated the surroundings became. I remember the air smelled fresher, cooler, and the light seemed softer, filtered through the tree canopy. We pulled up to the cabin just before sunset, the sky a mix of orange and purple. The cabin was older but sturdy, with a small porch, a wood pile neatly stacked by the side, and windows glowing with warm light inside. It had a rustic charm, and the girls were immediately excited. We unpacked, lit a fire in the stone hearth, and prepared dinner. The girls ran outside to chase fireflies while my wife and I set up the table. After we ate, we settled in to relax. I tried to check my phone for signal and noticed only one bar, barely enough to load anything. My wife's phone was worse, no service at all. The younger one, Emma, had a different carrier and somehow got a tiny bit of signal, maybe 1 or 2 bars, but no real connection. We told the girls to enjoy the moment, that this was our chance to unplug. No work emails, no social media, no calls. That first night, the silence was almost too much. The forest sounds were everywhere. The crackling fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, but no human voices, no cars. The cabin creaked as the wood settled and the wind pushed against the windows. It felt good in a way, calming. I lay awake for a while listening to the quiet. We had all agreed to leave our phones off the first night to enjoy the unplugged experience. The next day, we explored the area. There was a small trail that led into the woods, not marked but clearly walked often enough. The girls found a shallow stream where they skipped stones and tried to catch tadpoles with their hands. My wife and I talked about how nice it was to be away, how much the girls needed this break. We didn't see another person or house for hours. I tried calling the owner to ask about the landline in case of emergency, but the call didn't go through. Back at the cabin, I noticed a dusty old landline phone on a small table near the kitchen. It looked unused, the cord tangled and faded yellow. I picked it up and listened. There was no dial tone. I mentioned it to the owner when she stopped by the next afternoon to drop off firewood and check if we needed anything. She was a woman in her 60s, with a friendly but tired smile. "That phone's been dead for months," she said, her voice low. "No one's fixed the line because there's no real need anymore. No neighbors close by, and most people use their cell phones. But out here, cell service is patchy at best. You'll be lucky to get a bar." I nodded, feeling a little uneasy but thankful for the warning. She told us there were no other cabins within several miles, and that the closest town was at least an hour's drive back the way we came. She promised to check on us again before the weekend ended and left with a wave. That evening, after dinner, the girls were playing a board game by the fire while my wife and I cleaned up. Emma's phone, which had been mostly silent all day, suddenly rang. It was a strange sound, a harsh, ragged breathing coming through the speaker. There was no caller ID, just a blank screen. Emma jumped, dropping the phone on the floor with a surprised yelp. The room went quiet. I picked up the phone and stared at the screen, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I answered it, half expecting silence or a prank, but there was only silence. No voice, no background noise, just a heavy, oppressive quiet. I tried to hold the phone steady, listening. Then the breathing started again, rough, ragged, close. I told Emma to bring me the cabin phone. I wanted to see if maybe the landline could give us any clue or connection. She fetched the old phone, and I tried dialing my own cell. Nothing. No tone, no connection. I listened carefully and realized there was no dial tone either. It was as dead as the day the owner had said. I tested the line a few more times, just to be sure, but it was useless. The girls were now nervous, sitting closer to my wife. I reassured them as best I could that it was probably just some glitch or a wrong number, maybe some prank from cell towers out of range. Still, I felt an odd cold sinking in my chest. Something about that breath on the phone had been wrong. Too deliberate, too heavy to be random. That night, I double-checked the locks and peered out the windows. The forest was dark and still. I thought I saw a shadow move behind the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. The girls slept fitfully, and I stayed awake a while longer, listening to every crack and snap. The next day passed slowly. We kept close to the cabin, making sure the girls didn't wander too far. The cell service remained spotty. I could barely send a text to work to say I might be out of contact for the next few days. When the owner returned to pick us up, I asked her again about the phone and the strange call. She looked at me for a long moment before admitting the phone line had been dead for months. She said she hadn't mentioned it earlier because no one usually tried to use it. Also, she warned us that no one else lived close by. No neighbors, no passing hikers, nothing. She looked serious then, her usual friendly smile gone. You're really far out here. If you need help, you have to drive into town. There's no emergency service coming this way fast. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The silence around the cabin, the dead phone, the strange call, it all added up to one thing. Out here, we were on our own. No instant help, no quick rescue. We packed up the next morning with an extra sense of urgency. The girls were quiet, clinging a little more to my wife's side as we loaded the car. The woods seemed darker somehow, less inviting. The road back was long, and the cell signals slowly came back as we drove, the city noises creeping back in. I kept the phone call in my mind, the ragged breathing that came out of nowhere. Whatever it was a warning, a reminder that even in the quietest, most peaceful places, you're never truly out of reach of something you can't control. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see or hear, but the silence that follows. I rented the cabin for a week, thinking it would be the perfect escape from city noise and the constant buzz of everyday life. The place was tucked away near a small lake, far enough from the main road that it took a good 30 minutes driving on gravel and dirt just to get there. The air was crisp, the kind that smelled of pine and fresh earth, and the whole area seemed quiet and untouched. The cabin itself was modest. One room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a couple of beds. Nothing fancy, but it looked cozy in the photos online. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my bag, stacked some firewood outside, and walked down to the lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky and the thick trees lining the shore. A few birds called here and there, but other than that, the silence was almost total. I spent the afternoon reading and cooking a simple meal on the stove. I had no cell service out there, which was exactly why I wanted to come. No calls, no messages, no distractions. As night fell, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the last light fade from the sky. The woods around the cabin looked dark and thick, the tall pines casting long shadows in the moonlight. I felt a calm settle over me, like I was far removed from the rest of the world. That feeling didn't last long. Around 10 p.m., I noticed a small flicker of light deep in the woods. At first, I thought it might be a firefly or something natural, but the light wasn't blinking or moving erratically like insects do. It was steady and bright like a flashlight. I strained my eyes and saw it moving slowly through the trees, heading toward the cabin. I blinked, thinking I might be imagining it. but the light kept coming, moving through the dark woods. I grabbed my jacket and went outside to get a better look, stepping quietly onto the porch. The light moved cautiously, not rushing, just inching through the trees. For a moment, I thought it might be someone lost or maybe a local hunter. I didn't hear any voices or calls, just the soft crackle of dry branches underfoot. The light stopped at the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood and then faded into the shadows. I stayed out there a while longer, watching. After a few minutes, the woods went completely dark again. I went back inside and locked the doors. I felt a little uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing, just someone passing by or maybe a hunter checking the area. The next day was uneventful. I went for a long hike around the lake, collecting some wildflowers and taking pictures of the old trees. I even saw a deer drinking from the water at dawn. During the afternoon, I saw no one and heard no sounds except the wind through the leaves. But as soon as the sun went down, the strange lights appeared again. Each night, around the same time, I could see the faint glow of a flashlight moving through the trees. Sometimes it came closer to the cabin, other times it stayed far back near the water. One night, I sat on the porch for a long time, waiting to see what would happen. The light came slowly through the trees, steady and quiet. I could make out a figure this time, an old man standing just beyond a tree line. He didn't move or speak, just stood there, watching the cabin without blinking. His clothes looked worn, like something an old farmer or woodsman would wear. A faded jacket, a hat pulled low over his forehead. His face was hard to see in the dim light, but I could tell he wasn't smiling. The way he looked at the cabin was intense, almost like he was guarding it or waiting for something. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I just watched him watch me. After what felt like an hour, he turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. That night, I barely slept. The image of the old man's silent, steady gaze stuck in my mind. I kept thinking about who he was and why he was watching the cabin every night. My first instinct was to leave, but I reminded myself I had already paid for the week and I didn't want to run from something that might be harmless. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Every night, around 10 p.m., the light appeared and the old man stood beyond the trees, always watching. I tried to catch a better look during the day, but never saw him. The area around the cabin was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone living nearby. On the fourth night, I noticed something different. The old man was closer than usual, just a few yards past the tree line. I could hear the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl, but he made no sound. His posture was stiff, like he was waiting for something to happen. I kept my distance and stayed inside, watching him through the window. He didn't move for over an hour, then slowly turned and vanished into the dark woods again. After that night, I started searching online for information about the cabin and the area. I found a few old reviews from previous renters, some mentioning the strange man. They called him a hermit who lived nearby, someone who didn't speak or approach visitors, but just watched silently for days. No one seemed to know much more about him, just that he was always there, a quiet presence in the woods. Some people said he was harmless, just a loner who wanted to keep an eye on his land. Others felt uneasy, like he was more than just a man wandering the forest. I wondered if the cabin was on his property or close to it. Maybe he thought I was a threat, or maybe he was just curious. On my last night, I sat outside by the fire pit, the flames flickering and throwing shadows on the trees. The old man appeared again, his figure barely visible in the moonlight. This time, I didn't look away or hide. He stood there silently, watching the fire and me. I didn't feel fear anymore, just a strange sense of respect for his quiet presence. I thought about how lonely he must be living out here with no one but the forest. When the fire died down, I went inside, packed my things quietly, and left before dawn. Driving away from the cabin, I glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see the old man still standing there, watching. But he was gone. Later, after I returned home, I reached out to the rental company. They confirmed the stories I'd found online about the hermit. They said he was an old man who'd lived there for decades, never bothering anyone, but always watching visitors. They advised me not to get too close or try to talk to him. He wasn't dangerous, just very private. Looking back, I realized how strange the whole experience was. How a simple cabin rental turned into a silent watch with someone who seemed to belong to the woods themselves. It wasn't a ghost story or a horror tale. It was just a man and his land, watching in quiet solitude. I don't think I'll rent that cabin again, but I'll never forget the nights when the woods came alive with that slow-moving light, and the old man who stood just beyond the trees, silently watching. The couple had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for months. After weeks of planning, they finally found a small cabin deep in the woods, far enough from the noise of the city to relax and forget about work. The pictures online showed a cozy little house with a stone chimney, big windows, and a warm, wooden interior that looked inviting. The reviews from past renters seemed fine, nothing out of the ordinary. It was perfect, or so they thought. The drive to the cabin was long, but peaceful. The narrow dirt road wound through tall trees, their leaves whispering in the light breeze. By the time they pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the hills, casting a golden glow on the wooden walls. The air smelled fresh, with hints of pine and damp earth. They unloaded the car and stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the old wood floors under their feet. The living room was simple but comfortable. There was a worn leather couch, a small wood stove in the corner, and a low bookshelf filled with old novels and some board games. The kitchen was small but functional, with a stove, a fridge, and a basic set of dishes. They unpacked, lit a fire, and settled in with some wine and snacks. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but in a way that felt peaceful. That night, as they were getting ready for bed, the man noticed a heavy door in the corner of the living room. It was old, made of thick, dark wood with rusty metal hinges. The kind of door you might find in a cellar or a basement of an old house. It was locked tight, and there was no key anywhere nearby. The woman hadn't noticed it before. They tried to see if there was a way to open it, but it didn't budge. The next morning, the man called the owner of the cabin, a man who sounded friendly enough on the phone. He said it was just a storage closet, nothing to worry about, and the lock was probably there to keep the owner's tools and old things safe. He shrugged off their questions and didn't seem interested in talking much about it. They decided not to push it. During the day, they explored the area around the cabin. The woods were thick, with tall pines and ferns covering the forest floor. They walked along a narrow trail that led to a small creek where the water was clear and cold. Birds sang high in the branches, and the occasional squirrel darted across their path. The quiet felt good, and they both relaxed more than they had in weeks. That evening, back inside the cabin, they ate dinner and sat by the fire. The woman noticed the door again, but didn't mention it. Instead, she tried to enjoy the moment, feeling the warmth from the flames and the soft crackling sound. As the night grew darker, they got ready for bed. Around midnight, the man was awakened by a strange noise. At first, it was so faint he thought it might have been in his dream. But then it came again. Soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the wooden floor near the living room. Then, low whispers like someone talking quietly but not clearly enough to understand. He nudged the woman awake, and they both listened. The noise seemed to come from behind that heavy door. They sat up, eyes wide in the dark. The door didn't move, but the sound persisted for a few more minutes before fading away. Neither of them wanted to check the door at that moment. It felt wrong, almost like breaking some rule. The woman held the man's hand tightly, and after a while, they managed to fall back asleep, but neither could shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, they debated what to do. They decided to call the owner again, this time asking more directly about the door and the noises. When they explained what they heard, the owner's tone changed completely. His voice became sharp and defensive, almost angry. He told them firmly never to open that door under any circumstances and that it was for their own safety. When pressed, he refused to explain further and ended the call abruptly. The couple was uneasy after that. They didn't feel welcome, and the owner's attitude made them more suspicious. Still, they wanted to believe it was nothing serious. They decided to leave the door alone, but the mystery kept nagging at them. That day, they packed their things slowly. The woman noticed some scratches on the floorboards near the door, which hadn't been there before. The man found a faint, musty smell coming from the cracks around the door frame. It smelled like damp would mix with something else, something metallic, cold. They tried to ignore it, but the feeling of discomfort grew. Before leaving, the man checked online for any reviews or mentions of the cabin. To their surprise, they found a few posts on local forums from previous renters. The reports were vague, but chilling. People had talked about missing belongings, strange banging sounds late at night, and a heavy door in the cabin that no one was allowed to open. Some mentioned feeling watched or hearing footsteps when no one else was there. One review described loud thumping and banging noises coming from behind the door, sometimes lasting for hours. Another said they woke up to find some of their things moved or missing, but nothing was ever stolen outright. Instead, it was as if something was going through their stuff when they were asleep or out. They realized they weren't the first to experience something strange. The owner's warning suddenly made sense, but it didn't ease their worry. When they left the cabin, the woods seemed darker somehow, as if the shadows themselves had shifted. The man looked back once more before getting in the car, his eyes lingering on the locked door they had never opened. They promised each other never to return. The next day, the man called the local ranger station to ask if anyone had ever reported anything unusual at the cabin. The ranger told him the cabin had a history. Years ago, it belonged to a man who kept dangerous animals in a hidden basement room. The door led to a deep cellar where the man kept old equipment and cages for trapping wild animals he claimed were a threat to the forest. The animals were removed after an inspection, but locals still believed strange noises came from the cabin late at night. The heavy door wasn't just a storage closet. It was the entrance to that hidden basement, locked to keep people out. The banging and whispers were probably caused by rats, raccoons, or some other wildlife trapped behind the door, trying to get out, or just making noise inside the dark space. The couple realized that the noises weren't supernatural, but very real and very dangerous. The owner's defensive attitude now seemed like fear. Fear of what might still be behind that door. They felt lucky they had left when they did. The cabin was a peaceful place on the surface, but that locked door hid something wild and uncontrollable, something better left alone. From then on, the couple avoided cabins with locked rooms or unexplained doors. The experience taught them to trust their instincts and never ignore what feels off, no matter how cozy or inviting a place seems. They still talk about that weekend, the quiet woods, the heavy door, and the low, haunting sounds that chased them away. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you never see, just hear and feel waiting in the dark. It was early October when a group of us decided to rent an old log cabin tucked away in the woods for the weekend. We wanted a break from the city, a chance to get away from noise, screens, and the usual chaos. I was with 3 close friends, Mark, Lisa, and Dave, and we found the cabin listed on a small rental site. It was advertised as rustic and remote, somewhere you could truly disconnect. The photos showed a squat wooden building with thick logs darkened by age, a stone chimney, and a porch cluttered with weathered rocking chairs. The setting was perfect, deep woods surrounded by towering pines, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor was miles away. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky a dull orange fading into purple. The road was a dirt track, rutted and narrow, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and loose gravel. Pulling up to the cabin, the place looked even older and more worn than the picture suggested. The logs were cracked and gray, with moss creeping between some of them. The porch had a sag to it, and the wooden steps creaked under our feet. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust with smoke and something faintly sour like old damp clothes left too long in a closet. The floorboards were uneven, with some spots that moaned under weight. There was a small fireplace with a rusty grate, a couple of folding chairs, a wooden table scratched up and stained from years of use. The windows were grimy and streaked, filtering the outside light in dull patches. Despite the cabin's state, it had a charm to it. We laughed and joked as we unpacked, lighting a fire in the hearth to warm the place. The air inside was cool but dry. Outside, The trees were already thickening with shadows, their branches scratching softly against the roof with the night wind. The first night was mostly quiet. We sat around the fire, drinking beer and talking about work, relationships, and the usual stuff. When we finally turned in, the house settled with its usual creaks and groans. At one point, I thought I heard faint voices coming through the walls like low talking, but I shrugged it off as the wind or maybe the pipes. The others hadn't noticed, or at least didn't say anything. The next day, we spent hiking the trails nearby, walking among the trees, enjoying the crisp air. The woods felt alive in a different way. Quieter, thicker, somehow heavier than any forest I'd been in before. We kept the cabin door locked when we left and made sure the fire was out before heading out. Back at the cabin, the sun filtering through the grimy windows made the dust particles hang in the air like tiny ghosts. The place had this old, almost forgotten feel to it, like it was holding on to memories no one talked about. That night, as we settled into bed, the voices returned. This time, they were clearer, like two people arguing quietly. I could hear raised tones, but no words I could understand, just the anger and frustration in their voices. I nudged Lisa, but she was already half asleep and told me it was nothing, just the house settling or animals in the walls. Dave said the same. Mark made a joke about ghosts, and we all laughed it off, but the feeling in the air had shifted. The voices felt too close to ignore. When morning came, I was the first awake. The cabin was cold, colder than the night before. The fire had long died out, and the wooden floor was stiff under my bare feet. The air smelled faintly sour again, and I could still hear the faintest echo of voices behind the walls. I told myself it was just the wood expanding and contracting with the temperature, but the sound was too specific, too human. That day, we explored more of the surrounding woods, and I kept thinking about those voices. We talked about it briefly, but none of us wanted to admit how strange it really felt. It was easier to joke about it, to act like the noises were just in our heads. Back at the cabin, as the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped rapidly. We made dinner over the small propane stove, the dull click of the burner, the only sound besides the wind outside. Mark was the last to go to bed, and before turning off the lights, he pressed his ear against one of the logs near the fireplace. "Guys," he whispered, "I think I just heard my name." We all froze. It was impossible. No one outside the four of us knew we were here, and yet Mark swore he heard a soft whisper right through the wood. His own name, clear and slow. We didn't say much after that. The cabin felt like it was closing in on us, the walls seeming thicker and heavier, as if they were alive with secrets we couldn't understand. None of us slept well. Every little noise felt amplified. The wind scratching at the windows, the creak of the porch boards, the soft murmur behind the logs. The next morning, we packed up quickly. None of us wanted to admit it, but the cabin had an oppressive weight to it now. On our way out, we stopped by the small visitor center at the edge of the property to ask about the history of the cabin. The woman who owned the cabin was a middle-aged local with weathered skin and sharp eyes. She told us the cabin was built over the remains of an old homestead settled back in the early 1900s. A family had lived there, mother, father, and 2 children. One day, decades ago, they vanished without a trace. No signs of a struggle, no clues left behind. Just gone. Since then, the land had passed through different owners, and the cabin was eventually built on the site. Over the years, people had reported strange noises, whispers, arguments, footsteps, but no one stayed long enough to find out why. Hearing that, everything we experienced suddenly made sense in a way. The voices, the whispers, the feelings of being watched, all tied to something buried deep in the old walls and the ground beneath them. The woman said she didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. She thought the sounds were probably caused by the cabin's old construction, the wood shifting and settling in the cold nights, or animals living in the walls and under the floorboards. But the story stuck with me as we drove away. That night, I lay awake thinking about those people who disappeared, trapped somehow in the silence of those woods. The cabin had been built on their home, and maybe the voices we heard weren't ghosts but echoes, memories buried in the wood and stone, playing out over and over in the dark. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that the cabin holds onto its past. That the walls still remember the family who lived and vanished there, and that those faint arguments we heard were the last moments of a life long gone, but never forgotten. The road was long and winding, surrounded by thick trees on both sides that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The air smelled fresh and damp, a mix of pine and wet earth, a smell that always meant we were getting close to the kind of place we were after. My partner and I had driven for hours, the kind of drive where the miles blur together and all you can focus on is the sound of the engine and the dull ache in your legs from sitting too long. We were both exhausted but excited. This cabin rental was supposed to be our little escape from everything, work, noise, people, just us in the woods. When we finally pulled into the narrow dirt driveway, the tires crunching over loose gravel and scattered leaves, I felt a flicker of relief. The cabin sat at the end of the path, tucked back among tall trees with thick trunks and rough bark. It looked old but sturdy, made of weathered logs and a metal roof that had lost some of its shine. The porch was simple, with a rough wooden bench pushed to one side and a small stack of firewood piled near the steps. I noticed right away that there was no sign of anyone around, which was exactly what we wanted. But something caught my eye that made me pause. Sitting neatly side by side on the porch, just next to the door, was a pair of muddy boots. They were tall, heavy-duty work boots, caked with dirt and mud that looked fresh, like someone had been walking in wet soil not long ago. I stepped closer, curious. They weren't my style, but I knew my partner would recognize them. They were similar to the kind of boots our neighbor used back home for his farm. I looked around quickly, expecting to see someone nearby. Maybe the person who owned the boots was still around, or maybe the previous guest had left them behind. But the driveway was empty. No car, no signs of recent activity besides the boots. I called out softly, "Hello," but there was no answer. The woods swallowed my voice, leaving only the quiet rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. My partner joined me on the porch, and after a brief glance at the boots, he shrugged. "Probably the last renters left them," he said. "They forgot to take them, or something." I wanted to believe him. It made sense, after all. We weren't the first to rent this cabin, and if someone had been hiking or working nearby, muddy boots wouldn't be unusual. Still, a small part of me felt uneasy. It was the kind of feeling that settles deep in your chest when something doesn't quite add up, but you try to ignore it. We went inside and started unpacking. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and something faintly sour, maybe old fabric or dampness. The windows were small and thick with dust, but the place was clean. The furniture was basic: a worn couch, a wooden table with a few mismatched chairs, and a small kitchen with a rusty stove. There was a bedroom with a single bed and a closet with creaky doors. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy enough. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. We lit a small fire in the stove and sat close to it, trying to shake off the chill. The woods outside grew darker, the trees casting long shadows in the firelight that flickered through the cabin windows. We ate some cold sandwiches and drank water from the bottle we'd brought. Then the sound started. At first, it was faint, soft footsteps like someone walking slowly on dry leaves or twigs just outside. I froze when I heard it, looking toward the window. My partner heard it too and paused mid-bite. The footsteps stopped and the woods were silent again, except for the crackling fire. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was probably an animal or the wind moving branches around. But every now and then the footsteps came back, slower this time, almost like someone was pacing the porch or walking near the cabin in circles. I checked the door locks. Everything was tight and secure. The windows were shut, and there was no way in without making noise. I wanted to say something, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt a mix of nervousness and anger. Angry that someone could be so careless as to walk around outside a rented cabin late at night, possibly disturbing us, or maybe worse, watching. But when I looked out again, there was nothing. No shadow, no shape, just the dark outline of trees swaying in the night breeze. We went to bed with the curtains drawn tight and the door locked. I lay awake, listening to the silence and the faint creaks of the old cabin settling. The footsteps didn't come back that night, but the memory of them kept me tense. My partner finally fell asleep, but I stared at the ceiling, wondering who those boots belonged to and why someone would be outside in the dark when the place was supposed to be empty. The next morning, the sun broke through the trees, casting golden light over everything. I got up first and stepped onto the porch to get some fresh air. The boots were gone, just like that. I looked around carefully, half expecting to see someone hiding behind a tree or a bush, but there was no one. The dirt on the porch was dry now, and there were no fresh tracks or signs that anyone had been there recently. I told my partner, and he seemed just as puzzled. We had both been certain the boots were there the night before. We searched around the cabin, but there was no sign of footprints or anything else out of place. It was like the boots had vanished into thin air. Later that day, I called the cabin owner. I wanted to check if anyone else was supposed to be staying there or if the boots might have been left by the maintenance people. The owner sounded surprised. She said no one had been there for weeks, not since the last renters left, and the cleaning crew only came once a month. She assured me no one else had been around recently. That answer didn't settle the growing knot in my stomach. If no one else had been there, then who had those boots belong to? And why had they disappeared so suddenly? We decided to stay the rest of our trip, but I kept my phone close and checked every noise outside. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. The woods seemed different, somehow quieter but heavier. At night, the shadows felt deeper, and the breeze seemed to carry a faint echo of footsteps that never led anywhere. By the time we left, I was relieved to be back in the car, driving away from the cabin and its mysteries. I never saw the boots again, and I never found out who had left them on the porch that first night. But the memory of those muddied boots, sitting there alone in the quiet woods, has stayed with me. It's the kind of thing you try to explain away, but sometimes no explanation feels quite right. Sometimes things just don't make sense, and maybe in the middle of nowhere, that's the scariest feeling of all. I've been looking forward to this weekend for months. The idea was simple: get away from the noise and distractions of everyday life, rent a small cabin in the woods, and finally get some serious writing done. I'm a writer, but sometimes the constant buzz of the city, the endless notifications, and the clutter of daily life make it nearly impossible to focus. So, when I found a tiny cabin a couple of hours away from town, surrounded by nothing but dense trees and quiet, I jumped on it without hesitation. The cabin was basic: no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, just the bare essentials. It was a one-room setup with a small kitchenette, a wood stove, and a bed pushed up against the wall. Outside, there was a small porch with a couple of wooden chairs, perfect for morning coffee or late-night star watching. The rental website said it was peaceful, isolated, and perfect for creative solitude. I believed it. The first day was exactly what I needed. I unpacked my laptop, notebooks, and some snacks, then spent the afternoon writing with the window cracked open, letting in the fresh, pine-scented air. The sun was warm, the birds sang, and I felt that rare, delicious peace you only get when you truly step away from everything. That night, I went to bed early, tired from the drive and the day's work. The cabin was pitch dark except for the soft glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. I remember the sound of crickets outside and the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. It was the kind of silence that's almost too quiet, where every tiny sound becomes loud. I was asleep sometime before midnight. Then, suddenly, I was jerked awake by the slow creaking of the bedroom door opening. It wasn't a slam or a quick crack. It was slow, deliberate, and chilling. The door moved an inch, then paused, then another inch. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat up fast, eyes wide, staring at the door. But when I looked, no one was there. The room was empty. The door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the still air. I shook my head, thinking it must have been the wind. The cabin was old, after all. Maybe the door wasn't fully latched, and a gust had pushed it open. I got up, closed the door firmly, locked it with the small bolt, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy after that. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside made me jumpy. The next day, I tried to push the experience out of my mind. I told myself I was imagining things, that the cabin was just old and creaky, and that I needed to focus on my writing. The day passed without incident. I even laughed to myself, thinking how silly I was to be scared of the door. But when the second night rolled around, it happened again. Around midnight, I woke up to the same slow creak, the bedroom door moving open, just like the night before. My heart jumped. I sat up again, staring at the door. It moved the same way, inch by inch, as if someone was easing it open. But again, there was no one there. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening and watching. The door never closed, just stayed open a crack in the dark room. I eventually fell asleep with a lamp on and the door locked again, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I spent a restless night, waking several times, listening to the sounds outside. The third day, I decided I wasn't going to let this keep me from writing, but I couldn't ignore it either. I went into town and bought a small security camera. Nothing fancy, just a simple one that recorded to a memory card. I set it up in my bedroom, pointing it directly at the door. That night, I went to bed early, locking the door firmly. I tried to convince myself that I'd catch nothing unusual and that the whole thing was just my imagination. But when I woke up the next morning, my stomach tightened as I grabbed the camera. I plugged it into my laptop and hit play. The footage was in grainy black and white because of the low light, but it was clear enough to see the bedroom and the door. The timestamp showed it was just after midnight. The door started to move, just like I'd heard, the slow, inch-by-inch creak as it opened. Then, a shadowy figure slipped through the doorway. The figure was tall, thin, and moved silently. It didn't look around or make a sound. It stood in the room for almost a full minute, completely still. Then it turned and left, closing the door behind it. I watched the clip again and again. There was no mistaking it. Someone had come into my room while I was asleep. I felt frozen, my hands shaking. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right there. The figure was too vague to see any clear features, but the shape was unmistakably human. The rest of that day, I packed my things. I kept replaying the video in my mind and thinking about all the things that could have happened if the figure had moved closer or if I had been asleep when it came in. I felt unsafe in a place that had seemed so perfect just days before. Before I left, I looked around the cabin carefully. The windows were all locked, but the main door was old and creaked loudly when it moved. I realized I must have left it unlocked, or at least not fully latched the first night. Whoever or whatever had come and had to have gotten through that door. I drove away slowly, not daring to look back. I didn't sleep well that night. My mind kept replaying the image of that shadow, standing silently in my room, watching without moving. I never went back to that cabin, and I haven't rented a place alone in the woods since. The thought that someone could have been there, slipping in and out of my room without a sound or a trace, left me shaken. It wasn't ghosts or spirits. It was real. Someone had entered my space when I was vulnerable, and it reminded me how easily safety can be an illusion. I still don't know who it was or why they came, but I learned that some quiet places hold more danger than you'd expect. I was a freshman in high school when I first heard about OM. It was one of those stories that just sticks with you because it feels too real to be some made-up ghost tale and too weird not to make you wonder if it could actually happen. My friend Steve told it to our group about something that happened to his older brother Tim a few years earlier. I never forgot it. Tim was in college somewhere in New Hampshire. I didn't know much about the place then, but I learned later it was the kind of small, quiet college town surrounded by woods and narrow roads that twist and turn through the trees. One night, around 2 a.m, Tim and his good friend decided they wanted something to eat. Not just any food, but Dunkin' Donuts. The weird thing is the nearest Dunkin' was actually in a different state, so they had to drive quite a bit to get there. The drive out was uneventful, just the two of them, a quiet road winding through the dark, thick forest. When they finally reached Dunkin', they got their donuts and coffee, laughing and talking about classes and whatnot, feeling good to be out of the dorms for a bit. But the trip back is where things got strange. On the way back, they were driving along a narrow highway through the woods. The kind of road where trees lean close to the edges, and there's barely enough room for 2 cars to pass each other. The headlights of their car, lit up patches of the dark, dense forest on either side. It was late enough that there was almost no traffic. Suddenly, another car pulled up in front of them. It was a small, red compact car, but what made it stand out wasn't its make or model. It was that its paint was scratched and faded, and all the markings that might have told you what kind of car it was had been carefully scraped off. The only thing that seemed to be left was the license plate, which caught their attention right away. The plate had a black letter O and a green letter M. Just those two letters. Nothing else. The rest of the plate was blank, or maybe it had been wiped clean or altered somehow. Whatever the case, it was creepy enough to freeze Tim and his friend for a moment. They started calling this car OM, since it was the only way to describe it. The weird things started to pile up almost immediately after OM appeared in front of them. Tim told Steve later that his phone suddenly lost all signal. No bars at all, like they'd driven through some invisible dead zone. It was strange, but not entirely impossible out in the middle of the woods. Then, on the radio, something even odder happened. They'd been listening to a jazz station, but suddenly, without warning, it switched to a grunge rock station blasting Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. It was so random and out of place that it felt like a signal, like OM was somehow messing with more than just their vision. Tim and his friend started to get really uneasy. There was something about that red car that wasn't right. The way it moved, the way it stayed just far enough ahead to be seen, but not close enough to be understood, the way it seemed to follow them deliberately. Tim tried to shake it off. He slowed his car down, hoping that OM would just pass them and go on its way. But as soon as Tim took his foot off the gas, the red car slowed too, matching his speed perfectly. That's when Tim started to feel the real fear. He tried to speed up, hoping to get around OM and lose it on one of the twists in the road, but every time he hit the gas, OM did the same. It was like OM was taunting them, a predator playing with its prey. The road ahead curved sharply. Tim saw OM turn the corner first, and he and his friend thought maybe, just maybe if they stopped and waited long enough, OM would get bored and move on. They pulled over and sat there, hearts pounding, eyes glued to the spot where OM disappeared around the bend. Time stretched out, 20 minutes, maybe more. The night was still except for the occasional hum of insects and the faint rustling of trees in the wind. Every little sound made Tim jump, expecting OM to suddenly reappear. Finally, steeling themselves, they decided to continue. Maybe OM would leave them alone now. They crept forward, nerves raw, gripping the steering wheel tight. But as soon as they rounded that same curve, there was again OM just as far ahead as before, matching their speed perfectly. Tim's friend whispered something about turning back, but Tim shook his head. They had to get home. OM wasn't just following anymore. It was hunting. There was no escaping it on this narrow highway. Eventually, the road forked. One path led back toward the college town, the other deeper into the dark woods. Without hesitation, Tim took the path home. OM stayed on the other road, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Tim never saw OM again. Years later, I was sitting at home one night, doing homework and listening to the radio when a news bulletin came on. There had been a murder in a county nearby, and the only witness described seeing a red compact car leaving the scene. The same red car with a license plate that had a black O and green M. My heart stopped. I thought maybe I was imagining things, or that I'd misheard. But the next day at school, I ran into Steve, and he told me he'd heard the same report. Suddenly, the story wasn't just some weird college tale. OM was real. And it was far from where Tim had seen it. The strangest part was how OM seemed to travel, crossing state lines without any explanation, leaving a trail of unease and fear behind it. Months later, a friend of mine named Blake had an encounter of his own. Driving home at 2 a.m., Blake took a highway that cut through a canyon. Just like Tim, a red compact car with that same black O and green M plate pulled in front of him. Blake knew the story. So he fell behind the car as much as he could without losing sight of it. For the entire length of the canyon, OM stayed right in front of him, never speeding up or slowing down like it was testing him. At the end of the canyon, OM suddenly did a U-turn and vanished back into the darkness. Blake made it home, but he didn't sleep well that night. I never asked Steve for more details after that, and I never wanted to hear more. OM wasn't just a story, it was a warning. To me, OM isn't some ghost or monster. It's a person, or maybe a group of people, who uses the isolation of the woods and the dead of night to trap drivers on lonely roads. It feels like OM is a predator, and those roads are its hunting grounds. People like Tim, Blake, and maybe even the witness from that murder, they were all lucky to get away. But OM keeps moving, and the road never forgets. If you ever find yourself driving late at night on a narrow highway through the woods and a red compact car with a black O and green M plate pulls in front of you, just know this: slowing down won't help. Speeding up won't either. The only thing you can do is keep your eyes on the road, your hands tight on the wheel, and hope that when you reach the fork, you choose the right path to safety. Because OM will always be waiting just around the next bend. Running with my friend after school was something we both looked forward to. We didn't just run on streets or sidewalks. We liked to find trails that cut through the woods and hills near our neighborhood. There was one trail in particular that we kept going back to. It started just above a small park, then climbed up a steep dirt hill and led to a ridge. From the top of that ridge, you could see out over a valley below. It was quiet and open, mostly fields with cows grazing far off in the distance. The air was fresh, the wind often blowing gently, and the views were amazing. It felt like a little escape from everything else. The trail wasn't busy, and that was part of the appeal. It felt private, like it was ours for a little while. We'd run up the hill, racing each other, then slow down and walk at the top, catching our breath as we took in a view. Sometimes we'd just stand there, looking out over the valley, the sun dropping lower in the sky. The dirt underfoot was loose and dry, the smell of earth and grass strong in the air. Birds sang somewhere in the trees, and the only other sound were the distant lowing of cows far off in the fields. That day was no different at first. We started running from the park, breathing hard, our feet kicking up dust on the trail. The sun was still bright, but starting to soften, casting long shadows. The trail was quiet except for the crunch of our shoes on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze blew through the trees. After a few minutes, we slowed to a walk near the top of the hill, just before the ridge. We were tired and took a moment to drink some water from our bottles. We stood there for a minute, catching our breath and looking out at the valley below. The grass on the ridge swayed gently in the wind, and the sky above was clear and blue. Then it happened. We heard it, a sound so strange and wrong that I stopped breathing for a moment. It was an animal noise, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the usual calls or cries of birds or the typical sounds of farm animals. It was low, guttural, and twisted. Imagine something making a sound like a mix between a growl and a wheeze, but stretched out and broken, like it was struggling to breathe or in pain. It came from somewhere close, maybe just 20 or 30 feet away, hidden in the trees or bushes just off the trail. I remember the moment perfectly because my whole body froze. My heart stopped racing from the run, and a cold wave passed through me, making my skin crawl and every muscle tense up. It was the most unnatural noise I'd ever heard. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up like someone had just screamed behind me. I didn't even have to think. My body just reacted without words. That feeling when your instincts scream, "fucking no." It was the same feeling I got years later on a school field trip to an anatomy lab, when the smell of preserved bodies hit me so hard that I had to step outside for air. That smell made me want to run from the room, to get as far away as possible. That sound on the ridge that day hit me with the exact same wave of fear. My friend and I just looked at each other, wide-eyed and frozen. Neither of us wanted to move. The noise didn't come again right away, but that silence afterward was even worse. It was like everything held its breath with us, waiting. I tried to listen carefully. The air was still except for the faint rustling of leaves. The cows in the distance didn't seem to notice anything, but that sound, whatever it was, felt alive. It wasn't mechanical or like a car or any normal noise from the world around us. It was organic, raw, and broken. It came from something alive and close. After a long moment, I finally forced myself to step back down the trail, signaling my friend to do the same. Our legs were shaking as we walked quickly down the hill, not running, but moving fast. The trees seemed darker now, and every shadow felt bigger and heavier. The sun was slipping behind the ridge, and the light was fading faster than before. We didn't talk much, but I could feel my friend's tension beside me, the way her steps were uneven and quick. The usual comfort of the trail was gone. It felt like the place itself had shifted, like the ground was holding a secret that didn't want to be found. By the time we reached the park at the bottom of the hill, the sky was almost dark. The noise didn't come back, and we didn't want it to. We both knew we'd never run that trail again, at least not near dusk. The whole way home, I kept thinking about that sound. What could it have been? Nothing I can name made that noise. It was too wrong, too painful, too strange. I imagined animals I knew, coyotes, foxes, deer, but none of them make a sound like that. Later, I asked a few people who knew the area, including a local farmer. The farmer said sometimes sick or injured animals make strange sounds, but he'd never heard anything like what I described. He also warned me about mountain lions in the area, but they don't usually make noises like that either, mostly growls or screams, not the broken wheezing noise I heard. I kept thinking maybe it was an animal caught in a trap or injured badly somewhere. But if it was, why didn't it move or come closer? Why did it sound so unnatural? The thought stuck with me for weeks. I tried to push it out of my mind, but every time I passed near that trail or looked at the ridge, I felt the same chill. The memory of that sound was so vivid that I could almost hear it again. That awful, strange noise right on the edge of the trees. The last time I went back, it was during the day with a bigger group, just walking, not running. We stayed in the open and didn't stop near the ridge. I didn't want to risk hearing that sound again. I never told many people about that day because it sounded crazy. Who would believe me? An animal making a noise so wrong that it froze two healthy runners in place with fear? But it was real. It happened. I still think about it when I'm out on trails or in the woods. Sometimes, when the wind is just right and the forest is quiet, I swear I can hear that noise, faint and broken, hiding somewhere close but out of sight. And I know better than to get too close, because whatever made that sound is still there, somewhere up on that ridge, and it's not something you want to meet. I never thought a simple weekend trip with my friends would turn into something so unsettling, but it did. We had planned to get away to a big city, renting a nice apartment through Airbnb. The place looked perfect online, modern, clean, with lots of space for the four of us. The picture showed a bright living room with big windows, a sleek kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. It was in a busy part of town, close to restaurants and nightlife, which was exactly what we wanted. We were all looking forward to some fun and relaxation away from our usual routine. When we arrived late Friday afternoon, the host greeted us briefly and handed over the keys. The building was old but well-maintained. The elevator smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals, and the hallways were a little narrow, with the usual city noise coming from outside. We stepped inside the apartment, and at first, everything seemed just as the pictures had shown. The walls were painted a soft gray, and there was modern furniture, a big flat-screen TV, and a dining table that could seat all of us. It felt like a good place to spend the weekend. We started unpacking, throwing our bags onto the beds and couches. Everyone was chatting and laughing, already relaxed. The kitchen was stocked with some basic supplies: coffee, sugar, some spices, and the bathroom was clean with fresh towels. I was staying in the smaller bedroom near the back, while the other 3 took the larger bedroom and the living room couches. The apartment felt secure, the door locked firmly behind us. About an hour after we had settled in, one of my friends, Lisa, went into her bedroom to unpack her things. She's the kind of person who notices little details that most people don't. While arranging her clothes in the closet, something caught her eye on the ceiling near the door: a smoke detector. Nothing unusual, right? But as she looked closer, she noticed a tiny black circle inside it. It wasn't like a normal smoke detector sensor. This looked like a small lens. She called me over quietly. "Hey, check this out," she whispered, pointing at the smoke detector. At first, I thought she was joking, but when I got closer and looked up, I could see what she meant. There was definitely something that didn't belong there, a tiny lens, almost like a camera, hidden inside the smoke detector's clear plastic cover. My heart started beating faster. I'd heard stories about hidden cameras before, but I never thought I'd find one in a place I was staying. We didn't want to panic, so we pulled out our phones and searched online for what it could be. There were enough photos of hidden cameras disguised as smoke detectors to confirm our suspicions. This wasn't just an accident or some weird fixture. It was a camera built to watch us without us knowing. We quickly told the others and showed them. They were shocked and a little scared. We debated what to do next. The first thing that came to mind was to call the police. It felt like an invasion of privacy on a serious level. We didn't want to risk messing with the evidence by touching anything more than we had to. Lisa took some pictures of the lens with her phone, making sure to get clear shots from different angles. We called the local police department and explained the situation as calmly as we could. The dispatcher said they would send someone to check it out. About 20 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. They were professional and serious, asking us to show them the smoke detector with the lens. They examined it carefully, then took it down for inspection. They told us to stay in the living room while they searched the apartment. After about an hour, the officers returned with more news. They had found several more hidden cameras in the apartment. One was inside a small clock on the kitchen wall, another disguised as a USB charger in the living room, and a few tiny lenses hidden in vents and light fixtures. All of them were connected to some sort of recording device tucked away in a cabinet. The police told us that the host was suspected of illegal surveillance and that they would investigate further. They assured us that our safety was their priority and said it was good that we found the cameras early. They explained that it was a serious crime to secretly record people in private spaces, especially when those people had rented the place and expected privacy. We were all shaken. The thought that someone had been watching us, or could have watched others before us, was disturbing. We tried to imagine how long these cameras had been there, who else might have been recorded, and what the host's intentions were. We kept looking at each other, wondering if this nightmare was real or just some bad dream. The officers took statements from each of us and gathered the cameras as evidence. They promised to keep us updated. We canceled the rest of our weekend at that apartment and found a hotel nearby. It wasn't the getaway we wanted, but at least we felt safer. Later that night, I kept thinking about what had happened. It was hard to relax, knowing that someone had planned this secret surveillance. The police told us that the host was arrested for illegal surveillance, and the case was being handled seriously. It made me realize how careful you have to be when renting places. No matter how nice and trustworthy a listing looks, you can never be sure who you're really dealing with. The experience left me with a lasting sense of caution. I'm still shaken thinking about how close we were to being completely exposed in what should have been a private space. It made me more aware of the little things in places I stay, and I always check smoke detectors, clocks, and chargers now. That weekend taught me a harsh lesson about trust and privacy. The city trip didn't go as planned, but at least we caught it early before anything worse happened. The host faced charges and lost their ability to rent out the apartment again. The police used the camera's recordings to investigate further, and they found evidence that other guests had been watched without their knowledge. It was a relief to know that justice was being served. The city seemed less welcoming after that, but we learned to be more careful, more aware. Looking back, I'm grateful we found the hidden cameras and called the police right away. It could have been so much worse if we hadn't noticed the tiny lens in the smoke detector. That small moment of attention probably saved us from something truly awful. I still tell this story to friends as a warning, because it's important to stay alert, especially when you're in someone else's space. Privacy is something we all deserve, but sometimes we have to fight hard to keep it. A few years ago, I was working as a consultant to the Provincial Forestry Service during one of the worst wildfire seasons we'd seen in decades. I was hired for specialized drone work, thermal and infrared mapping, ash pit surveying, fuel load estimation. Most of what I did required high-end drones with IR and LiDAR systems, and my job was to get accurate data about active fire lines, residual heat signatures, and hazards like ash pits hidden under the soot. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was useful. Life-saving even. Fire crews used that data to plan their operations. It mattered. I was 60 years old at the time, a cancer survivor, missing a couple of toes on my right foot from a post-treatment infection a few years earlier. I wasn't the most agile guy anymore, but I could still work a drone rig better than most. I could read the terrain and the data. That made me valuable, at least for a while. The area I was working in was deep in the mountains, a 6-hour drive from the near cell signal, and every movement we made was with helicopters or all-terrain rigs. There was no driving in and out. The roads were logging cuts and old fire roads barely wide enough for a quad. Everything smelled like dry pine needles and creosote. The heat was different up there. It didn't just feel like sun-on-skin heat. It felt like the air had turned into an oven, and you were the meat roasting in it. The ops plan that day, same as most days, was to be airlifted onto a ridge above the active fire, do my data collection, and get picked up again. That meant a tow-in landing. A tow-in is when a helicopter doesn't fully land but rests the tip of one skid on the side of a ridge or cliff. It hovers the rest of the way and just balances there while you jump off fast. The pilot doesn't wait long. You're out and clear where you're left behind. And then they toss down your gear case, 70 pounds of equipment, most of it fragile and all of it expensive. The first few days of this rotation went fine. Stressful but routine. I was tired. My bones ached more than usual, and every landing made me mutter curses under my breath. Still, I managed. I never had the lungs for mountain climbing even before cancer, and I sure as hell didn't after. But I made it work. That particular morning started off rough. I couldn't put my finger on it, but everything felt off. The air was too still, too quiet, and the light had a weird color to it. Usually, even in fire season, there's birds, insects, background noise. That morning there was nothing. Just that dirty, brown-orange light you get when smoke filters the sun. We lifted off before dawn. The sky was glowing at the edges, and the valley below was a bowl of darkness filled with smoke. I sat hunched in the back of the chopper, holding onto a loop on the ceiling with one hand and my gear case with the other. I try not to look down when the pilot banked hard to the left to line up the ridge. That made me feel like I was falling sideways into a cloud of burning fog. I hated those parts. You never get used to them, no matter how many times you fly. When we reached the drop point, it was worse than I expected. The ridge was barely 2 feet wide, maybe 2.5 at the widest spot. Sharp rocks, loose gravel. On both sides, nothing but air and a 1,000-foot drop straight down. On one side was an actively burning slope, with whole trees torching, exploding into flames, and sending up black columns of smoke that twisted like snakes. On the other side, a steep ravine choked with old fuel and newer ignitions. I didn't have much of a choice. I jumped. My boots landed solid, but I had to fight to stay balanced. One misstep, and I'd be tumbling in a fire or worse. The gear case came next, landing just to my left and bouncing once. I dove and grabbed it before it rolled. That case had the LiDAR module, batteries, monitors. A mistake here would be tens of thousands in damage, not to mention my own job security. I spent the next hour doing what I came to do. Unpacked the drone, fired it up, ran diagnostics, then launched it down the valley. The controls buzzed in my hands as I guided it through thermal columns and smoky updrafts. I kept half my attention on the screen and the other half on the horizon. Fires move, fast, and drone gear doesn't work well when it's melting. Mapping the fire lines, scanning for residual ash pits, logging hot zones where new ignitions were possible. It was work I'd done 100 times before. The drone flew smooth. No signal loss. Good altitude hold. I almost relaxed. Almost. By the time I brought the drone back and packed it into the case again, my shirt was soaked with sweat. Not just because of the heat, either. I radioed base, confirmed coordinates, and called for pickup. The chopper responded. They were on their way. I waited. 10 minutes went by. I could hear it. The faint thump of the rotors echoing off the ridge lines. Then nothing. Then closer again. Then nothing. Like it was circling but couldn't commit. Eventually, the radio crackled and I got the update. Too much smoke. Visibility was under 30 feet. They couldn't see the original LZ, and the alternate was just as bad. They weren't going to risk it. They told me to head northeast. That side of the fire was cooler, they said. Easier going. They would try to meet me further down where the tree cover might be thinner. Cooler. Easier. That's when I realized something with a sharp, heavy kind of clarity. I stood there, staring at the valley disappearing under the smoke, holding 70 pounds of sensitive, fragile, absolutely essential gear on a mountain ridge during an active wildfire, and I realized I had no good options. No cell signal, no trail, no safe direction, and I was 60 years old. I'd beaten cancer, lost a few body parts along the way, and now I was about to haul this gear through a burning forest, hoping I could outrun a fire with bad lungs and a worse leg. I was too old for this shit. Still, I clipped the gear case to my pack harness, tightened the straps until it cut into my collarbones, and started walking. Well, not walking, climbing, ducking, sliding, crawling. The trail was nothing but forest floor covered in ash and embers, crisscrossed with roots, rocks, and fallen trees. And fire. Within 20 minutes, I had to duck under a tree that had partially burned and fallen at a diagonal. The bark was still smoldering. When I came out the other side, something landed on my shoulder. It was a piece of burning moss. Just a little thing, size of coin, but it lit up my sleeve like a spark on dry grass. I dropped to the ground and rolled. Hard. Got the fire out. Tore the sleeve off. Kept moving. It happened again and again. Burning pine cones dropping from trees. Flaming needles fluttering down like deadly confetti. I was hit in the back of the neck by a branch that fell from above. It left a blister the size of a walnut. I stopped every 50 feet to roll in dirt. I was breathing in smoke so thick I couldn't tell whether my nose was bleeding or not. I drank water. I stayed low. I walked until I couldn't. Then I'd sit for a minute, mouth open like a fish, sucking down smoky air and coughing it back out. Once, I heard something crash ahead of me and froze. A tree, 30 feet high, fell across my path, fire eating its center. When it hit, it sent up a cloud of ash that blocked everything for a solid minute. I crawled under it. Another time, I got tangled in roots trying to scramble up a slope. Fell hard. The gear case slammed into my ribs, knocked the wind out of me. I laid there, eyes watering from smoke, chest heaving, knowing I had to get up. So I did, over and over. I kept going. I don't know how long I was out there exactly. The radio stopped working halfway down. Too much interference. The drone gear was half-cooked and rattling in the case. My shirt was in shreds. My pants were soaked in sweat and dirt and bits of ash that stuck to the skin like glue. Then, maybe 4 hours after I'd started, I saw shapes in the smoke. At first I thought I was hallucinating. Just shadows. Then the shadows moved. They had helmets. Firefighting gear. Bright yellow. One of them pointed. They waved me in. I stumbled forward. I didn't speak. Couldn't. Just coughed and handed them my gear case like it was some kind of cursed treasure I was unloading. One of them took it, the other put a hand on my shoulder and led me like a blind man down a narrow slope to a clearing. There was a flat stretch of dirt, a windsock tied to a burnt stump. The helicopter was there. I don't remember getting in. I don't remember taking off. I came to in the med tent at base camp, covered in dirt, wrapped in damp cloths, with an oxygen mask strapped to my face. My lungs burned. My arms were shaking. I had little blisters on my ears, on my neck, on the backs of my hands. My socks had melted in my skin in places. They sent me to a hospital the next morning. 2 nights there. Smoke inhalation, mild burns, exhaustion. The ER doc said it could have been much worse. I never went back. I didn't need to. I had a meeting with the fire ops chief a few weeks later and told him I was done. I couldn't do it anymore, and I didn't want to. I'd done my job. I'd gotten the data. I'd survived. That was the last wildfire I ever mapped. I was with a backpacking group in North Carolina in 2018. It was early spring, one of those strange weeks where the weather didn't know what it wanted to be yet. Some days it felt like late fall. Others like winter hadn't loosened its grip at all. We were on day 3 of our trip, and so far things had gone pretty smoothly. The group was a mix of strangers and friends, led by a professional guide and a co-leader. Everyone carried their own gear, and we were hiking through the Pisgah National Forest somewhere off the Artlope Trail. That morning, our goal was to summit the smaller of the two Pilot Mountains. I still don't understand why North Carolina has two mountains named Pilot, one big and well-known, the other a little quieter and more tucked away. That's the one we climbed. We reached the summit around mid-morning. The view was better than I expected. Low rolling mountains with layers of blue ridges folding into each other, and you could see the cloud shadows moving slowly across the land like ghosts of weather. We all sat down to snack, hydrate, and take photos. People were laughing, stretching out on flat rocks, enjoying the sun that had finally broken through. I remember sitting on a small outcrop, eating peanut butter on a tortilla and watching a hawk glide beneath us. The wind was cool, but not biting, and I remember thinking this was the kind of moment people try to find out there, where everything slows down and you just feel very small in a good way. Around noon, we started heading back down. I was somewhere near the back of the line, chatting a little with the person behind me, but mostly focusing on my footing. The trail was steep in places, and dry leaves covered parts of it like slippery paper. We'd only been walking for maybe 15 minutes when I felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over me. It wasn't the normal, sort of lightheaded feeling from standing too fast or being a little dehydrated. It felt deeper, like my balance had suddenly gotten rewired. I stopped walking and stepped off to the side to rest for a second. Then everything hit at once. My stomach turned inside out, the world started spinning, and I barely had time to lower myself down before I collapsed onto the forest floor. I remember reaching out toward a tree trunk for support, missing it, and falling on my side. Then came the vomiting. Violent, uncontrolled, like my body was trying to reject everything inside me at once. I don't know how long it lasted, but it felt like I lost track of time. Some people from the group noticed I hadn't kept up and circled back. Our main guide made it back to me and knelt beside me. I couldn't really focus on his face. I was shaking and drenched in sweat, but I was also freezing. My clothes stuck to me in patches, and I couldn't keep anything down. Not water, not the electrolyte shoe someone gave me. Nothing. They tried to make me as comfortable as they could. Someone gave me their foam pad to lie on, and someone else covered me in an emergency bivvy and another sleeping bag. I was half aware of people moving around me, whispering, discussing things in low tones. After about an hour, the guide made the call for the group to split up. Most of the group had to keep moving toward camp. It was still hours away, and it was getting colder by the minute. The guide stayed with me, along with a co-leader and one other person. A satellite communicator was used to call for rescue, and from what I understood later, an EMT was dispatched first to evaluate me before anything bigger could be arranged. The wait felt endless. I couldn't stop vomiting, even though there was nothing left in me. My muscles ached from the convulsions, and every few minutes the forest would spin again, like I was trapped inside a washing machine. The temperature started to drop in the late afternoon. What had been mild and manageable in the daylight quickly shifted into something more dangerous. Cold air sank into the forest and settled around us. I couldn't stop shivering. Even wrapped in layers, I was losing heat. Someone lit a small stove and tried to warm up a bottle of water to act like a heat pack, pressing it against my core. My limbs felt distant and useless, and I was barely lucid. I remember the EMT showing up, kneeling beside me in the fading light, his hands cold and fast as he checked my pulse and vitals. He spoke with the guide, then with someone on the radio. They couldn't wait any longer. I was told later that the 4 helped rehydrate me, but it also lowered my core body temperature even more. They had to do it, though my dehydration was severe and worsening. I couldn't sit up without retching. I couldn't even drink from a bottle without gagging. My vision would swim in and out like the lens of a broken camera. I was aware enough to know I wasn't okay. There was a heaviness settling into my chest. Not emotional, but physical. Like gravity was pulling harder than usual. They said the rescue team was trying to chainsaw a new trail up toward us to carry a stretcher. The trail down was too narrow and rocky in places. The official trails weren't wide enough for a team to get a litter through safely. It was taking longer than expected, and darkness was closing in fast. The EMT and guide made the call to get a helicopter on standby, just in case things continue to go downhill. But helicopters are tricky in those mountains, especially near tree lines and in low visibility. Weather, terrain, and risk all come into play. So we waited. I remember the sound of chainsaws somewhere down the slope. It was faint and distant, like someone was working in another world. I drifted in and out of sleep, or maybe unconsciousness, I don't know which. I would wake up to someone shifting a blanket, or a gloved hand checking my wrist, or tucking something under me. One of them kept talking quietly, not to me, but just to fill the silence. At one point, I remember hearing a barred owl call from somewhere out in the trees. I didn't know what time it was. The dark had fully settled by then. It was around 9 p.m. when the rescue crew finally reached us. I couldn't see their faces, just headlamps moving through the trees and the sound of boots and gear. They moved fast, efficient. They strapped me into a litter with heavy-duty blankets and insulation, and I remember the cold metal frame pressing into my shoulders. The team lifted me smoothly, and we started moving. I was mostly aware of motion and cold and pain in my stomach. Every bump hurt. My body wasn't working right. My head lolled to one side, and I couldn't lift it again. They carried me down to where a small clearing had been made, just wide enough for an ATV to reach. I remember the roar of the engine and the brightness of the lights as they transferred me. From there, it was a rough ride down the mountain. I don't remember much of that stretch, just that the shaking made me nauseous again. I kept my eyes closed and tried to hold on to the few steady things I could feel: someone's hand on my shoulder, the hum of the motor, the feeling of being moved and handled and not alone. Eventually, I was transferred to an ambulance waiting on a dirt road at the bottom. It was bright inside, too bright. They asked me questions and ran through a few tests. Then it was more movement, more roads, and the whine of sirens in the distance. I faded in and out. The hospital was small, rural, and felt oddly empty when we arrived. The EMTs wheeled me in, and I was taken in for tests: a CT scan, EKG, and blood work. The staff worked quickly and quietly. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, they told me the tests came back clear. No signs of a heart attack. Nothing wrong on the scan. I wasn't dying, but I still couldn't walk. I couldn't sit up for more than a minute without getting dizzy. I felt like my body had been gutted and left on a slab. That's when they told me I had to go. They said they couldn't admit me and that they needed the bed. They offered to call a cab, but I had no wallet, no phone, no idea where I even was. They just wheeled me out into the waiting area, handed me a sheet of paper with my discharge info, and left me there. It was around 3 a.m. I was alone, still unable to stand. I didn't know how far we were from the trailhead or where the rest of my group was camped. The cold had crept in my bones and settled there. I sat there for what felt like hours. The waiting room was dim and silent except for the occasional beep from the front desk computers. I felt like I was in limbo, half alive and forgotten. Then a nurse came out. She didn't say much, just looked at me, then looked around. She wheeled me quietly down the hall and into a small and used room. The lights were off and the bed was made. She helped me into it, tucked me in, and brought me a bottle of water and some saltine crackers. She never told anyone, just left me there and said she'd check back in a bit. I stayed there until morning. I couldn't sleep. My body still trembled from the shock and the cold. But I was alive. I was inside, and someone had shown me a kindness I didn't know how to repay. The group came back for me the next day. They'd broken camp early and hiked out fast. One of the leaders had borrowed a truck from a ranger station and came to pick me up. Seeing a familiar face felt like being pulled out of a dream. They helped me out of bed, slowly, carefully, and walked me to the car. I couldn't carry my pack. I couldn't even lift a water bottle without shaking. It took days for my body to recover, even longer for my brain to feel steady again. Nobody ever figured out what caused the vertigo. Maybe dehydration,